What you're about to hear is part 4 of my hopefully 5-part series on the two wars in Vietnam, the First and Second Indochina War. We are trucking along here with the American War, the Vietnam War. If you haven't checked out episodes 1 through 3, now would probably be a great time to do that, but far be it from me to tell you how to do your stories. Listen to it out of order. That's fine with me. Might help to have a little bit of context, though. And a quick announcement before we get into the episode. I have started a Substack, and there's going to be a link to that in the show notes below. This will be an email newsletter that will come out whenever I post an email for you to check out. It's going to be an announcement in your inbox whenever a new show comes out, but also I anticipate doing some bonus content on there as well. Maybe some additional writings or maybe some additional podcasts. Haven't quite figured it all out quite yet, but I anticipate posting some extra things on there. And at the very least, you're going to get a message in your email inbox whenever a show goes out. So go subscribe to the Substack. And while I have you on a wild goose chase, why don't you just go leave a 5-star rating and a review wherever you happen to be listening to the show. I greatly appreciate it. And honestly, I'm so thankful for all the kind words everybody has said about the shows. It really does mean the world to me. All right. All those caveats and asides out of the way, let's hop into it here in Hell in a Small Place, Part 4.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
There can be no peace in the world until the military power of Japan is destroyed.
We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
I always think it's interesting to explore history with the perspective that the people living at the time didn't have all the information like we do right now. It changes things when you realize that not everybody at the time knows how things end. I mean, it goes without saying, right? If you knew how things would end, you would probably do things differently. But since you don't know how things are going to end, it leads to how you imagine things could go, how you prognosticate, how you guess. Problem is, guessing is inexact, right? You're not always working with all the information, and you, more often than not, are going to be wrong. And so it leads to moments in history when people make decisions that we look back and we go, how stupid is that? How foolish. But you got to remember, they don't have the information we have. And so, as armchair historians now, we go back and we judge how things went, but things at the time are so different than they are now, and it changes your perspective on things. In 1966, in January 1966, a series of hearings kicked off in Washington, D.C. about the Vietnam War. They would become called the Fulbright hearings, and they were broadcast during the day, which is really interesting because it's a series of hearings that eventually come to kind of represent the resistance movement to the Vietnam War, and they are broadcast in the middle of the day, which, if you want somebody to watch a program, you're going to put it in prime time. It's going to be like 8 o'clock at night. Everybody's going to gather around the couch, gather around the TV set. They're all going to sit down and watch it. But if you broadcast it at, 1 o'clock in the afternoon, well, how many people do you think are actually going to be able to watch that? As it turns out, with these Fulbright hearings, the majority of people watching these are women. It's one of those things where you go, oh yeah, well, if you don't want anybody to see it, you're going to put it in the middle of the day, but you take it for granted. These hearings that end up becoming so important to public perception of the war early on, 1966, it's still pretty early, right? We still haven't had 1968 yet. Perception gets shaped by these hearings. And these hearings are kind of convened at the behest of William Fulbright. William Fulbright was a guy who spoke to a lot of veterans, a lot of soldiers fighting in the war already. He supposedly spoke to some 200 soldiers in Vietnam. William Fulbright said at these hearings, quote, "The war is not going well. The situation is worse than reported in the press and worse, I believe, than indicated in intelligence reports." He then quotes an officer to a reporter. And this officer said, quote, "If there is a God and he is very kind to us and given 1,000,000 men and 5 years and a miracle in making the South Vietnamese people like us, we stand an outside chance of a stalemate." End quote. In these hearings, William Fulbright is questioning the strategy of the Vietnam War. Not only questioning the strategy, he's questioning why the hell we're there in the first place. William Fulbright's hearings in the Senate tend to be the beginning of a lot of these questions that are asked later on as the war develops. These questions of why are we there? What are we hoping to achieve? Is it even possible to achieve what we want to achieve? But not just William Fulbright himself makes this an interesting moment. It's because you bring in other members, decision makers, people that have a role in this thing. You've got Maxwell Taylor, Secretary of State Dean Rusk. You've got Senator John Stennis, who ends up having thoughts on this thing as well. And you get a look, if you're sitting at home, which, wives and mothers were at the moment in time, you're sitting at home, you're getting actual opinions by people who matter in this whole conflict for the first time. William Fulbright's biographer wrote about the hearings afterward, quote, "that the hearings opened a psychological door for the great American middle class. It was Fulbright's ability to relate to this group, as well as his capacity for building bridges to conservative Senate opponents of the war, such as Richard Russell, that would make him important to the anti-war movement." End quote. Ultimately, out of these hearings, you get two main outcomes. One, you get to see the different prognostications for how these decision makers think it's going to go. You've got some ideas like the Americans should take these little hamlets or spotted spots on a leper's back, like what the Vietnamese had done in the French Indochina War, where you have like this archipelago of places that you hold. The U.S. should consolidate these places, almost fortify them and hold those, and not push forward into North Vietnam. You've got some ideas that say you should just invade North Vietnam. You've got other ideas that they should pull out completely, and still others that say we should just bomb them, as Curtis LeMay said, as we talked about in the previous show, bomb them into the Stone Age and leave. Maxwell Taylor supposedly said at these hearings that he just thought, and, give him credit, he's operating within a framework that at the time made sense. He thinks that the North Vietnamese are going to give up, that if we just continue to apply pressure, that there's going to come a point where they can't do it anymore. Of course, as we know now, many years later, as the armchair historians, the Vietnamese could take a heck of a lot more than people at the time thought they could. On the flip side of this, there is an idea that begins to foment in Washington, specifically from John Stennis, this idea that Lyndon Johnson, his limited war idea isn't enough to get the job done. And anytime you're thinking about, a war, military maneuvers, you're thinking, what are we going to get out of this? What are the victory conditions? And John Stennis, in these Fulbright hearings, brought out the idea that makes sense as well. What are we hoping to achieve? Is a limited war going to be enough to achieve what we want to achieve? So out of these hearings, you get folks that back Stennis's view that, hey, we should just go all in. you also get folks that say, we need to pull out completely. And you get this division. And it becomes kind of a populist, divisive thing, starting in 1966. Fulbright hearings are, I think, the first moment when the middle class, the regular people, get a really good idea of what's happening in Washington, and people balk. And then slowly but surely, households across America are getting the news, getting up to speed on what's actually happening in Vietnam. And I would imagine this is probably the first time that regular people, they know about the Vietnam War, they understand it, but not everybody is going to know intricacies about the conflict. They're not going to know about strategy. They're not going to know about what's actually going on until the Fulbright hearings. They would have heard about the Tonkin Gulf resolution. They would have seen the speeches that Lyndon Johnson would have given about it, and it would have just been the generic sort of stuff. We don't support communism. We're trying to maintain a free government in South Vietnam. You would have gotten that, but you wouldn't have gotten the real stuff. The stuff that's happening behind closed doors. And you get that in the Fulbright hearings, and everything starts to shift a little bit. The conversation around the Vietnam War adopts a new tenor, one that hadn't really been the case so far. There's two things that kind of come out of this combination of people being able to witness what's happening in Vietnam in their living rooms, and also how the war is being waged over in Vietnam. You see, if you're in your living room, and I'm trying to imagine what it would have been like if I were somebody at home just watching the updates on the news as they came across the ticker and whatever else. And two, I'm coming at this 55, 60 years later. And so the America that I know is very, very different from the America that is in 1966 and 1967. A lot of what made America what it is today happens in 1968, 69, and 70, and it's almost like a whole different world. Here's an example. If you are an American in 1967, you get to witness the war on your TV, because Vietnam is the first war and probably the only war since where journalists have easy access, I say easy access with air quotes, have access to soldiers fighting in the war. So it's very common that you're going to have a journalist and a cameraman that will accompany soldiers on operations and kind of hang back while the soldiers do their thing and then interview them afterwards, almost like it's a football game and they're doing post-game interviews with soldiers afterwards. You're even catching highlight clips of the soldiers in action. So you'll see a clip of a soldier firing off his M16 and then, ducking for cover. It's an incredibly common occurrence. And so what it does is it creates this scenario where people at home get to actually see what's happening over there. Not only do you get to kind of see the spreadsheets and you get to read the letters that are sent home, but you get to see them on TV. Imagine a Twilight Zone sort of scenario where you're a mother or father and you see your son pop up on the national news because he just happens to be near a journalist or a cameraman. It's just a very odd kind of confluence of events where this has not happened since, and for many reasons. One of those reasons being, if you get to witness the war on your TV, you get to actually witness the war on your TV. And so what does that mean? It means that you get to see what war is in all of its big ugly. So not only do you have people at home getting to witness the Fulbright hearings, so you're getting, a high-level view of strategy, but you're also getting to see the reports on TV at night too. And so if you're somebody who really wants to be dialed in, you theoretically can be. You compare that to now, It's very difficult to know what's happening on the ground for, I think some would argue, good reasons. You don't want people at home to be able to witness exactly how things are going and play into your enemy's hands, which is sometimes what happens. You see in this conflict, celebrities take the side of the North Vietnamese because they are witnessing what's happening and they are seeing that perhaps things aren't, how they should be, or things seem a little off. You start to read arguments from free thinkers about how the United States are no different than the colonial French. We're just doing it the American way, right? Jane Fonda becomes one of these celebrities that is an outspoken proponent of the North Vietnamese. It wasn't just her. There were others as well, but Jane Fonda kind of becomes the poster child for pro-Vietnamese sentiments in the United States. She would famously go to Hanoi in 1972 in an incident that is famous. She poses for the camera. A lot of people at the time, and for good reasons, thought she was anti-soldiers, anti-America, turning on her country. And there's people, even today, that will have nothing good to say about Jane Fonda and others like her. The other element here too, is something that we mentioned in the last show, but I think we danced around it. We didn't quite say it overtly. When we're talking about a conflict like this, you have to know what your victory conditions are. And victory conditions for the Americans at this point in the war are essentially bringing the North Vietnamese, the Hanoi Politburo, that government, bringing them to a point where they were going to decide and make the logical choice that they couldn't continue the fighting. So it's a point where you go out and you find North Vietnamese forces, you destroy them, and you continually bomb North Vietnam and basically restrict their ability to produce things that can help them win the war. So you're bombing factories, again, in air quotes, factories, places where theoretically military production can happen. You're trying to create a scenario where Le Duan and the Hanoi Politburo come to the conclusion logically that they're finished. And the way that General William Westmoreland decides to go about this is using conventional tactics at the time to bring about this effect on the ground, in combination with Operation Rolling Thunder, which is continuously dropping bombs on North Vietnam in areas around the DMZ and on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The conventional tactics of the time are called search and destroy tactics, where, as you would imagine, you send groups of soldiers out on individual missions, sorties, if you will, and you would go locate North Vietnamese troops, the regulars, and you would destroy them. And theoretically, if you do this enough and you destroy enough of them, we kill more of them than they kill of us in a certain amount of time, in a time horizon that you project, let's say we kill 20,000 of them in 6 months, that kind of thing. We kill enough of them in a certain amount of time, we will create the conditions where the Hanoi Politburo decides they can't do it anymore. Fred Wayand has a quote where he's talking about Westmoreland's search and destroy tactics, and it is somewhat emblematic of the oversight, or the thing that Westmoreland seemed not to take into account in his calculations. Fred Wayand, a commander of the 25th Division in Vietnam, said, quote, "One of the agonies you'd go through is that you'd send out a sweep operation, maybe take 15 men killed. Then after that operation, we'd have to pull out of there. And then when we went back a month later, we had the same problem all over again," end quote. He would then continue, quote, "It just seemed ridiculous," end quote. In his book, Vietnam, Max Hastings writes about the math, or how everything is kind of waged on a spreadsheet. If your victory conditions are creating a scenario where your enemy doesn't want to continue the fighting, and the way that you bring that about is by killing enough of the enemy soldiers that the enemy decides, okay, I've lost too much, I can't keep doing this. If that's how you want to do the war, it creates an odd scenario in practice. Max Hastings writes, quote, "Officers and men learned to dread the words body count. Yet in a war with no prospect of raising a flag in the enemy's capital, there seemed no other plausible yardstick of success. Contrary to myth, this was not an original concept. Every army in every war judges its progress partly on how many enemies it kills or captures. In Vietnam, however, this became obsessional, so that commanders belabored subordinates who failed to deliver a sufficiency of corpses. Their attitude promoted a carelessness, if nothing worse, about which of the enumerated dead were communist fighters, how many were hapless peasants." End quote. One of my favorite memoirs of the war is Vietnam Precazy by Bill Earhart. In it, he gives so many anecdotes, and he does it in a raw way, and it's one of those books where, you know how this thing goes. You read a book that other people aren't reading, and you find out it's really good, and you get excited about it. That's what Vietnam Precazy was for me. He relates a story in his memoir where he's explaining to a girl he met how this concept goes of going in, counting bodies, that whole concept of the fighting. He says in his memoir, quote, "You know what we do? We get sniped at from some ville. Some guy, maybe even doesn't live there, takes a couple pot shots at us. We call it an airstrike. Couple of snake eyes, couple of napalm canisters, instant French fries, level the whole ville." When he's talking about a ville, he's talking about a hamlet or a little group of houses together. They called them a ville. "Then go in and count up the bodies. Oh yeah, the brass likes body counts. Anything dead is VC. And you know what, Dorrit? I can't make it read like we scored a great victory against the forces of communism and evil. It's easy. Call somebody's house an enemy structure. Call a bomb shelter an enemy fortified position. Call a hopeless old man a detainee. Bingo. Facts and figures, we win. Not only can I do it, I have to do it. They don't want to know the truth, Dorrit. They got the whole thing worked out, Dorrit, and you better not be the one to tell them we ain't getting nowhere." End quote. He would then continue in this same conversation, quote, "And we ain't getting nowhere. No place at all. Oh, there's VC around somewhere. I know because they keep killing my buddies, but I'll be damned if we can find them. Round and round, just go chasing around our own tail." End quote. I think it's probably worth a little refresher on guerrilla warfare and where this all comes from. We have talked about this in bits and parts throughout these shows, but the Vietnamese approach to waging war is directly tied to Mao Zedong's approach to guerrilla warfare. And if you'll recall, in previous shows, we talked about how Bernard Fall was warning everybody, like, hey, here's how they want to fight. They are following Mao's tactics of guerrilla warfare, and people weren't necessarily listening to him because this idea of guerrilla warfare was revolutionary. It was a concept that the West hadn't really understood yet, and honestly, throughout this entire conflict, they would struggle to fully understand it. Things got better as you came in increased contact with it, but for the most part, the counter to guerrilla warfare was never fully understood throughout this entire conflict. I went and found Mao's book where he's writing about guerrilla warfare. And he's writing this while China is fighting off Japan, the imperialists in Japan. And the Vietnamese took Mao's approaches to guerrilla warfare, Vo Wenzap primarily. He took Mao's approaches. They also had Chinese advisors who are, throwing out Mao's approaches. And the Vietnamese are adapting this to their own struggle. So when I read what Mao writes about guerrilla warfare, it's going to sound really similar because this is what the Vietnamese have been doing this whole time. This is Mao himself writing about guerrilla warfare. Quote, "In a war of revolutionary character, guerrilla operations are a necessary part. This is particularly true in a war waged for the emancipation of a people who inhabit a vast nation. China is such a nation whose techniques are undeveloped and whose communications are poor. She finds herself confronted with a strong and victorious Japanese imperialism. Under these circumstances, the development of the type of guerrilla warfare characterized by the quality of mass is both necessary and natural. This warfare must be developed to an unprecedented degree, and it must coordinate with the operations of our regular armies. If we fail to do this, we will find it difficult to defeat the enemy." End quote. That will sound really familiar to what the Vietnamese are doing because the Vietnamese have two prongs, if you will, in their military approach. They have the NVA, the regular forces that are kind of built in the image of Soviet forces, Western forces, but then you also have the Viet Cong, the guerrillas. These guerrillas are directly tied to the population. They are ideological cadres of the Communist Party in Vietnam. They are infiltrating constantly, and they typically will come, they come out of Hanoi, but they'll come from Co Vinh, which is in South Vietnam, the, operational center of Viet Cong operations in the south of Vietnam. In fact, Le Duan, who takes over the Communist Party, was one of the first heads of Co Vinh in South Vietnam in the Delta. But anyways, you've got the guerrillas, you have the regulars. They operate two different ways. The regulars operate like an army. The guerrillas are perpetrating these smash and dash attacks, these bombings, these terror attacks, these beheadings of local chiefs, these fill in the blank. The upshot of guerrilla operations like this are that it's very difficult to counter. If you don't know who your enemy is, everyone is, which on the one hand is great. If you are operating, guerrilla tactics, but the downside of guerrilla tactics are that your enemy can't distinguish between friend or foe. When your enemy can't distinguish between friend or foe, that means innocent people get caught in the crosshairs. So when we talk about military operations in Vietnam, this is the thing that's going on constantly in the background. You have search and destroy missions trying to find the NVA regular troops, often coming in contact with Viet Cong, or Viet Cong coming in, on smash and dash missions here and there. And so it's a convoluted, non-linear, almost like a ball of yarn. So I'll be honest with you, trying to tell this story is a bit like pulling threads out of a ball of yarn, chasing down that thread, and then just moving on to another thread. And so you have this wild, topsy-turvy, non-linear sort of storyline going on. Return back to the Bill Earhart book, Vietnam Procasey, where he's talking about when he first arrives in Vietnam. And he doesn't fully understand. I mean, he's got to learn the lay of the land. And his sergeant, a man named Saunders, is kind of giving him the heads up. He's the newbie. He doesn't know how to keep his head down, how to stay alive. Saunders is giving him a heads up. Bill Earhart is waving as they are driving through a hamlet to their base. And Saunders notes that he's waving and says, quote, "Who do you think you are? Douglas MacArthur? Then Saunders broke into a broad grin and clapped me on the back with the flat of his hand and a gesture of goodwill. Better pay attention, kid. We get sniped at along this road all the time. Half the people you're waving at are probably VC. A couple of weeks ago, some guy tossed a grenade into a truck right here in the marketplace. Messed up a few guys real good. End quote. He continues later, a few days later, when they're on base and a few guys bring in Vietnamese prisoners and they're treating them incredibly roughly. And Earhart protests. Saunders tells him, just be quiet. This from Bill Earhart, quote, Saunders warned me that I'd better keep my mouth shut tight, my eyes wide open until I'd been around a while. Now he's quoting Saunders. Those tractor boys hit mines out there in the sand every day. Great big mines, and they get shot at a lot. A driver was killed by a sniper the day before yesterday. These people know where these mines are and who's planting them and who's doing the sniping. Treat them nice within sight of the tractor park, and those guys will rearrange your head and ass for you and walk away grinning. End quote. This is the rub, right? The belief amongst American soldiers is that the locals know who's planting all these mines, who's doing all these beheadings, who's, generally fomenting the revolt, the revolution. So if you believe the locals know something, they are complicit in the actions of the guerrillas. And in a lot of cases, that would be accurate. The problem is, there's caveats galore, right? They're not necessarily perpetrating the actions themselves, but they are, by all accounts, somewhat complicit in the actions. If they know who's planting the mines and where they're planting them and keeping their mouths shut, well, in the minds of the soldiers there, they might as well be planting the mines themselves. So you treat the locals roughly, but then when you treat the locals roughly, you create this scenario where you are kind of eroding the trust, as you say, the hearts and minds, but that was never there in the first place. And instead of, building allies with the Vietnamese locals, you create enemies. When you create enemies, the cycle continues over and over and over again. And then word gets back home about the conduct of soldiers there. And then people back home are like, well, we should be fighting our wars a certain way. We should be the great shining light, the police force, the sheriff, we're just there to maintain law and order. And when on the TV screens back home, you hear reports that soldiers are cutting off ears, shooting old men and women, blowing up hooches or homes, destroying villas, killing children and innocents. Local opinion, American opinion of the war turns on a dime. What do you do when your entire perception of your country is rooted in this concept that you're the good guys, that you are helping a backwards place, get with the times. You're liberating people from their communist oppressors. But when your soldiers that you send over there to fix the situation are in some cases, and maybe in many cases, not a whole lot better, or are involved in situations where innocents are killed frequently, what does that do? What does that do to your collective consciousness? Oh yeah, and let's throw in the other element here. You have a movement happening back home, a free love movement, a movement that defies the status quo. Status quo says our lawmakers, our decision makers have all of our best interests at heart. That they know what they're doing, we trust them, they'll figure it out. None of them are doing underhanded dealings, are making decisions without our best interests at heart. They would never lie to us. But what if they do? What if they lie, and what if your soldiers in a far-off place operate in a way that's less than ideal? And what if you see it on TV? What does that do to the Midwesterner, from Iowa, who's got this whole concept of how the world works, and that concept of how the world works is shattered? And what if an entire collective country has an idea of how the world works, and that idea is shattered? What does that do to your country? And yet at the same time, there's this nuance to it where if you're a soldier on the ground, you would protest and say, yeah, but we're getting shot at, mortared, bombed. Booby traps are laid for us. We don't know who our enemies are. We go out and we do an operation. We kill a few VC, maybe a few NVA. We run into them. We engage, lose a few of our guys, kill some of theirs. You come back and you haven't really gained anything from it. There's no tangible effect. So in your mind, if you're a soldier, you feel like, oh, those 15 guys that just got killed, they got killed for nothing. And it spawns this idea of radicalism within the soldiers on the ground because they're so frustrated they can't get their hands on the enemy. And when they do, oftentimes you won't even collect bodies. You might kill a few Vietnamese and then they'll be dragged away. You have nothing to show for it. No apparent cause and effect. John McNamara wrote home about loose talk amongst soldiers about the need to employ terrorist attacks against, what they viewed as terrorists. He said, quote, "Just a few years ago, it was confined to the fringe. If the actual U.S. military establishment ever started going that way, good grief, quite decent people become frustrated. Beware the wrath of the centurions." End quote. And all of this, not to say that you don't have really upstanding, strong individuals there either. When you draft an army, obviously you're going to bring in all sorts of individuals into your fighting force, but you're going to draft, the good along with the bad. There's a officer named Walt Boomer, and this is from Max Hastings' account of the Vietnam War. He writes about Walt Boomer, quote, "One day, Walt Boomer's battalion medical officer led the captain aside and warned him that his men were collecting ears from corpses. Boomer gathered the company around him that night, sat them down, and said, quote, 'If you ever do this again, I'll kill you. What would your mother say?' End quote. He believed tough leadership was the only way forward. And it reminds me, too, of a conversation I had with Professor Edwin Moise, where he's talking about, you have competent officers, competent generals that show up in Vietnam and they get a battalion that's unusable. The morale is so bad, training is so bad, that you almost can't wrangle them. You can't do anything productive with this group of men. It's a terrible battalion. There are many reasons for that, but in this case, this is a competent general who went on to have an extremely distinguished career. By all accounts, an excellent officer, an excellent general. And when he was in Vietnam, the battalion that he got was so bad he couldn't do anything with it. You get that situation quite a bit. And so you have all of this nuance where you can't say definitively, oh, you've got bad soldiers. Oh, you've got, it's really difficult to make black and white judgments about this thing because you have to almost take the good with the bad. And yet for all that you want to recognize that there's good, there's certainly bad there too. Walt Boomer, who'd later go on to be a 4-star general and lead all the U.S. Marines in the Gulf War, said about these search and destroy missions that MACV would send American troops on in Vietnam. He said, quote, "We were looking for a fight every day, hopefully on our terms. I soon began to realize this guy's sitting back and he's watching. Sometime he's going to see a moment when you get a bit careless and he's going to whack you. He knew the terrain and we didn't. I remember a terrible day we had. We were advancing down a very narrow valley of mixed brush and we got hit pretty hard. They ambushed a platoon which had 3 men killed. I lost one guy who had a Navy Cross. We thought, we've got artillery and air support. If only they stick around, we'll get them. But they didn't. That operation wasn't a part of anything larger. It was just me and the company going through the country and clearing whatever that meant. How many of them did we kill? I don't know. Headquarters was furious about the poor kill ratio. End quote. This is another thing that's almost worth a pause, is just how terrible the terrain is for waging warfare. At least if you want to fight in a conventional sort of Western sense. I looked it up on Google just to get like a general definition for what Western warfare is. And Google, in all of its infinite knowledge, said that conventional Western warfare involves attacking the enemy's military with direct force. Based on everything I read, that sounds like a pretty great definition. You're trying to create these direct confrontations that are decisive or have some sort of fallout or meaning. Whereas if you are doing some guerrilla warfare, every contact with the enemy doesn't necessarily produce any direct results. So in this conflict, you're fighting in an Eastern sort of way, and you're having to throw out all these conventional Western tactics that you grew up learning at West Point. The terrain in Vietnam directly influences that, because how can you create these confrontations, these direct confrontations with the enemy, if the terrain doesn't even allow you to gather X number of men or tanks or, anti-aircraft weapons or mortars in one place? You can't put them all together in one spot. So the counter is these search and destroy missions. Captain Chuck Redenlau wrote to his wife back at home while he was in Vietnam. He said, quote, "No single piece of earth is less suited to waging conventional warfare. Oozing water into which one sinks to the knees, trees and underbrush so thickly entwined that it is impossible to force a man's body through in many places. Giant trees whose upper bough structure keeps the ground in perpetual half-light." End quote. Not only is the terrain not suited for the conventional sort of warfare that the Americans are used to, but the key part of this, if you're going to be successful for the United States, is you need to marry your force to the South Vietnamese force, to the client force there on the ground. And in the previous show, we talked about how the United States would continually say it would be Dean Rusk, it would be McNamara, it would be Johnson or Kennedy or whoever is calling the shots, right? The thing that would be said was that everything is about South Vietnam, propping up the South Vietnamese government, partnering with the South Vietnamese government. And that all sounds great, but if you're going to partner with the client state, partner with the South Vietnamese, the way that's going to work is you're going to empower them to win the war, right? And on paper, South Vietnam has a large army. I think I read here that in 1966, they added 159,000 new recruits to the South Vietnamese army, to ARVN. The problem is, instead of seeing Vietnamese soldiers fighting Vietnamese soldiers, you see American soldiers fighting Vietnamese soldiers. And instead of empowering South Vietnam to do the fighting, the United States just does the fighting. It's sort of like when, you're trying to fix something maybe, and your little cousin comes up. He's younger, right? And he wants to help. And initially you say, yeah, you can help. And you tell him what to do. And then he begins to do it and he's not doing it very well. And so you take over and you just do it. Because, you're on a time crunch, right? You just need to get the thing done. And the little cousin isn't doing a good job of it. So you just take over. That, to my mind, is sort of how this situation plays out. And yet, that doesn't take into account the South Vietnamese perspective, the Saigon perspective. I found a conversation between U.S. Marine Bill Earhart and an Arvin sergeant, a South Vietnamese sergeant. And this South Vietnamese sergeant almost acts as the foil to everything that Earhart believes in this story, because he points out all of the hidden things that the Americans don't acknowledge, kind of in broad strokes, but also for Earhart himself. He's poking holes in all of these things that Earhart never really reckoned with. Bill Earhart says to Sergeant Trinh, he just didn't think. This is a continuation of their conversation. He just didn't think. Then Trinh says, yes, I know, he just did not think. That's what's so sad. None of you mean any harm. You just do not think. Corporal Earhart, I have seen you taunt Vietnamese men in the market for holding hands. You call them homos. Did you know that it is our custom? It means only friendship. If a woman held hands with a man in public, that would be something bad. I didn't know that. No, I said. This is Earhart speaking, feeling my face flush with embarrassment. In America, it means in America, Trinh laughed softly. This is not America, Corporal Earhart. Such simple things, yet none of you ever bother to ask. Every day you are losing the war in 1,000 little ways, and none of you see it. The gook shop, he snorted. What do you think the laundry girls tell their friends when they go home at night? Is every young woman in America a prostitute? Why do you think our women are? Then Trinh continues later. My father was killed by the Japanese when I was very little. I never knew him. We were living in the Red River Delta then, not far from Haiphong. When the communists took over in the north, my mother was afraid. She thought the communists would kill us because my father once worked for the French in the post office. That's what people were saying. So we fled to the south. My oldest sister died along the way. She stepped on a mine. I don't know if it was a Viet Minh mine or a French one. It does not matter. After another silence, he reached into a box by his feet and pulled out a letter. It's from my sister, he said. My mother has been killed by American artillery. I did not even get to bury her. Trinh continues. Do you know how long I've been fighting? I was drafted when you were 12 years old. I've been fighting for 6.5 years, and there is no end in sight. Every year it gets worse. Every year the Viet Cong grows stronger. When I was drafted, the VC fought us with sharpened bamboo sticks and Japanese rifles and French rifles. Now they fight us with Russian rockets and Chinese grenades and American machine guns. You are their best recruiters. You Americans come with your tanks and your jets and your helicopters, and everywhere you go, the VC grow like new rice in the fields. You do not understand Vietnam. You have never bothered to understand us, and you never will bother because you think you have all the answers. Do you know what Uncle Ho says? Now he quotes Uncle Ho. You Americans will tire of killing us before we tire of dying. Sometimes I think he is right, and sometimes I think you Americans will never grow tired of killing. Bill Earhart in the conversation next points out what he thinks is the trump card, that the South Vietnamese asked for the Americans' help, that the Americans are coming to the aid of a little backwater country, right? That they're going to civilize them, police them, help them. Trinh responds to him in their conversation sharply. Quote, Key and Tu and the rest of those fat, bloated bandits who are getting filthy rich from the war, they asked for your help. They do not speak for the Vietnamese. They don't speak for me. Your President Johnson is too ignorant or too arrogant to understand such a simple truth. You help the whores and the pimps, and you take the people from the land where their ancestors were buried and put them in tin cages where they cannot fish or grow rice or anything but hate and die. And if they do not want to leave the bones of their ancestors, you call them communists and beat them and put them in prison and kill them. You Americans are worse than the VC. End quote. Trinh then continues a little later. Quote, If the people ruled Vietnam, those dogs would be cut by 1,000 knives. He's referring to Win Cao Ki and Tu. Those dogs would be cut by 1,000 knives. They are exactly the kind of pigs and vermin you Americans like because they do not argue with you, and they grin like fools while you and your friends destroy a Buddhist temple. Did you know that a Buddhist asking for peace almost won the election, even though no newspaper in Vietnam was allowed to tell his story? Did you know that Tu has already thrown him in prison? And you Americans praise Tu and tell yourselves you are helping us. Sometimes I think you are the most evil nation on earth. End quote. The South Vietnamese government, we talked about the incompetence, the wheedling, the lack of ability to run South Vietnam adequately. And never more is that such a present thing than when you look at the military. The ARVN was ill-provisioned, ill-trained, ill everything. Max Hastings writes in his book, Vietnam, quote, "Rich Vietnamese might dine off crab or meat noodle soup, fried fish, spiced steak, stewed duck, and rice, followed by lotus fruit stuffed with nuts. Their less privileged compatriots seldom starved, but the skinniest were those who served their country in uniform. Soldiers were hungry even in barracks because officers stole much of their rice ration. Many enlisted men moonlighted as taxi drivers, teachers, or construction workers. An American advisor discovered that whenever he was absent in the field, his Vietnamese driver rented out their Jeep. Officers as well as soldiers said, 'How can we fight on empty stomachs? To be able to practice the correct way, to be honest men, one must first have enough to eat.' A U.S. combat ration for one meal contained 3,800 calories, almost twice the daily calorie allocation for an ARVN soldier, even in the unlikely event that he received it. A general described lieutenants taking home most of the issued rations to feed their families. Now quoting the general, quote, 'I saw infantry school instructors pack a piece of plain bread or a ball of sticky rice in their rucksacks at the start of a long field exercise. That was all they could afford for breakfast and lunch. Many officers fell heavily into debt just to keep their families fed.' End quote. At the top of the tree, there were richer pickings. Some generals sold goods to the enemy, typewriters, cigarettes, Hondas, even claymore mines and grenades. In the words of an NLF cadre, now a North Vietnamese communist, quote, 'More than a few American soldiers were killed with mines bought from their Vietnamese comrades.' End quote. At the Geneva Convention, at the Geneva Accords after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the agreed upon way forward was going to be a DMZ at the 17th parallel and also free and fair elections for all of Vietnam, right? Obviously, those elections never happened when they were supposed to. And Ngo Dinh Diem was supposed to be the guy that was representing South Vietnam. Obviously, he's not in the picture anymore. And so South Vietnam, in the wake of Diem's passing, has to figure out who's going to be the new guy forward. You could look and say maybe it'll be Big Min or one of these other generals. But there is a bit of a power struggle. And if you're in Washington, D.C. at this same time, you're looking at this internal strife and squabbling as a worrying development for the heart of South Vietnam. Not only are the soldiers starving, hungry, their families are not necessarily being provided for, and in the field they're losing, but not only all of those things, you don't have the one thing you need if you're the United States in order for this thing to continue on the way you need it to. You need a stable government in South Vietnam. For the Americans, the representation of stable government, of free government, is elections. If you have free and fair elections, that means everything is hunky-dory, From the outside looking in, everything looks great. They elected their own leaders, that kind of thing. So in 1967, the United States pressures South Vietnam as a government to elect a president and a vice president. The issue with forcing elections like that at that moment in time is you don't really have anybody in control. You've had military juntas kind of one after the other, but you haven't had any kind of, it's not like there's parties where, they can furnish one or two candidates and those candidates duke it out, and all of a sudden the winner of that's your winner. There's many candidates from many different backgrounds, and all of these candidates, a lot of them anyway, have come up through the military, or perhaps they are from a Buddhist background, perhaps they have a farmer's background. But the thing that happens in 1967, these elections, is there's a bunch of candidates. And generally what happens when you have a bunch of candidates is that they split up the vote. So, if you think about this from a United States perspective, usually you've got two main candidates from the two main parties. And if anybody comes in from like a third party, from an independent party, a green party, or whatever it is, however much of the vote these independents or these green party candidates gather is pulling away from the two main candidates. And so it kind of waters down the playing field. Well, what happens when instead of having two main candidates, like the United States might back one or two candidates or prefer one or two candidates, what happens if you have 15? How watered down does the vote get then? And if you're trying to kind of like keep your finger on the pulse of, what kind of government the South Vietnamese have, you can't really control anything. How do you control what seems uncontrollable? If you are just waiting for some corruption to pop up, for some things that are questionable to happen, this would be the moment. The two main candidates that the United States would prefer are Nguyen Cao Ky and Nguyen Van Tu. Ky is an interesting individual. I think if any of these figures deserves a look up on the internet, go look up pictures of Nguyen Cao Ky. He reminds me of Harrison Ford in Star Wars as Han Solo. He's a guy who wears colorful uniforms, has polished shoes, the sunglasses, the aviators. He's got his medals over his breast. He's usually wearing military uniforms. And usually, more often than not, he has attractive women under each arm. We are talking about a Bruce Wayne, Han Solo, kind of a playboy military background type. Colorful to say the least. And Nguyen Cao Ky is opposed by Nguyen Van Tu. These are the two candidates that at least the U.S. feels the best about. I think it's probably because they are maybe the most easily controllable, or in some ways the most malleable. Tu is very much understated, meek in some respects, at least from the outside looking in. You'll find him often, if you look up pictures of him, you'll find him in a suit. Just looks very unassuming, looks like your regular run-of-the-mill politician, slicked back hair. Somebody the United States could work with. At one point, Ellsworth Bunker, the ambassador to Vietnam, called both Ky and Tu to his residence, to the ambassador's house. And when you've got all these different candidates, the one that the United States is most likely to back is going to be the one that has the control of the military. So Ellsworth Bunker calls the two generals into his residence, and you can imagine the scene. There's been bickering back and forth and arguing. Everybody's trying to figure out who is going to be the next president of South Vietnam amongst these generals. And they have booted out different generals like Big Min, one of the foremost generals involved in the Diem plot. He seems like he would be the next guy. Well, no, Ky and Tu have sort of blocked him out, and it's just these two. Bunker calls them in and he says, figure out who's going to be the president. The United States is not going to tolerate another coup. Can't have it. It has turned into the sort of thing where you have a sound that plays on the radio if you've got another coup coming. You can't establish any sort of stable government if every government you establish just gets overthrown 6 months later. Washington figures that if Tu and Key can come to an accord about who's going to be the president, theoretically you can consolidate the power struggle in Vietnam. The two of them run on the military platform, and you get an election in 1967 where candidates with Buddhist backgrounds boycott the election. The Viet Cong in South Vietnam use intimidation tactics to kind of shape the election from their own perspective. Got to think of it from the North Vietnamese perspective, from the Hanoi perspective. They are trying to get the weakest candidates into office, and they intimidated, kind of created scenarios where certain candidates were blocked out. And the United States basically just said, if there's any candidate that does not approve of the war effort, they don't get in. So the only candidates approved, once everything kind of comes down to it, are candidates that approve of continuing the war, candidates that are not Buddhist, and candidates that are not intimidated by the VC. Tu and Key end up winning with 35% of the vote. Phan Hoang Dung wrote a research paper about the 1967 election, and he concluded, after interviewing people who were there at the time and reading Ellsworth Bunker's letters back to Washington and other research documents, that, quote, 1967 was the first and also the last year that the civilian had participated in the formal democratic process to raise their voices and opinions. But the conduct of the election had shattered every last bit of trust in the ruling military government. Consequently, the military establishment could not work with the civilian faction to utilize their expertise in running an economy and civil society, for example. More evidently, the 1971 presidential election saw no committed civilian candidate, partly due to the deeply rooted mistrust derived from the authoritarian conduct of the 1967 election. As for the common people who expressed little to none interest in politics, it was not mistrust but fear that had driven them far away from the government. It was noted by Mr. Tien in the bystander group that all the citizens wanted at the time was stability, peace, security, but the oppressive and repressive actions had certainly not convinced them about the stable future for the Republic of Vietnam. End quote. While in the South Vietnam is fighting for its political life, trying to appease the Americans, the North Vietnamese in Hanoi are undergoing some growing pains of their own. And this is something that, when you're reading the historiography afterwards, you don't get this part of the story very much. And it is due to the fact that the North Vietnamese after the war just don't release their records. And during the war, people outside of Hanoi, people outside of this insulated bubble, don't really have a clue what's going on. There are very few books that write about the inner workings of the Hanoi Politburo. One of those is Hanoi's War by Lien Hang Nguyen. And I think it's a really interesting subject because when you have kind of this boogeyman character almost as your enemy, it's really difficult to make this a three-dimensional story. Now that we have some of this information, it does illuminate and bring character to a lot of what we've said before. In fact, in reading Hanoi's War, I think some of the characterizations of different people like Le Duan is probably incorrect. Some of the characterizations I've even made in previous shows, now I'm listening back to them and I'm like, ooh, that's probably not quite right. Even now, many years later, Le Duan is a polarizing character, I think, to say the least. What do we know at a base level fact? We know he was the leader of the Communist Party in Hanoi. We know he was a proponent of, shall we say, radical tactics. What I hadn't really seen in books prior was the stuff happening around him with other people involved in the decision-making process. It seemed like in the First Indochina War and then leading into the Vietnam War, Your decision makers were going to comprise of a small group of men, but the main guys were going to be Ho Chi Minh, Vo Nguyen Giap, Phan Van Dong was going to be in there, Trong Chin. But what's really difficult to know for sure is who is calling the shots. Ultimately, Le Duan takes over the Hanoi Politburo. Even still, there's not a whole lot written about the inner workings, and you kind of had to do some digging. Now we actually have some of that information, which I think is really fascinating. And we talked about how people at the time in North Vietnam preferred the way of life in South Vietnam because they have this perception, especially when Diem is the president in South Vietnam, because they have this perception of, this free life where they're poor and they're struggling, and the infrastructure in North Vietnam hasn't recovered from the first Indochina War. And so, peasants in north of the DMZ, they want to be south of the DMZ, but then people south of the DMZ want to be north of the DMZ because they don't know what life is like up there because nothing gets out. That is kind of the case for the rest of the world as well. Nothing gets out. But the main thing that comes out of Hanoi during this time is there is incredible fracturing within the decision-making Politburo over what is the tactics going to be and which of their allies are they going to lean on more. They kind of have to play the Soviets and the Chinese off of one another, which creates an incredibly tense situation in Hanoi because they are the client state for both Russia and China. And Russia and China happen to have their own ideas for how this war with the Americans should be fought. You'll notice too, Russia and China tend to also have their own ideas about tactics. And just like how the Americans like to dictate their tactics on the South Vietnamese, the Soviets like to dictate their own tactics, and the Chinese like to dictate their tactics. And if the Vietnamese use one country's tactics over the other country gets frustrated. Soviet tactics are more Western in nature. They are focusing on urban and city areas, using more recognizable military forces. So to put it simply, if the Vietnamese were to adopt Russian tactics for their military, that would have meant more use of the regulars, the NVA. They would have used their army to attack urban centers and then almost have like these Stalingrad style battles in the cities. And they would take cities one by one and they could retake South Vietnam that way. The Chinese style was what Vietnam was doing for the most part with their revolutionary guerrilla style of warfare, which emphasizes having guerrillas that also partner with your regular forces. And the guerrillas create havoc, chop heads off people, throw bombs and grenades, create terror and havoc. And there's 3 phases to that style of guerrilla warfare that Mao Zedong purports as being, the way forward. These are 2 very different styles and approaches, and the Soviets think their way is the best way. The Chinese think their way is the best way. And so at any given point throughout, a period from 1954 to 1968, either the Soviets or the Chinese might be considered the stronger power, and so therefore their way of doing things is the way that the Vietnamese need to appear to be doing things to appease the Soviets or the Chinese. There emerges this split in the Vietnam Politburo, the Hanoi Politburo, called the Sino-Soviet split. Lien Hang Nguyen, in her book, Hanoi's War, writes this about the split and how it affected the Hanoi Politburo. She writes, quote, "Just as the East-West conflict forced the post-colonial world to choose a side, the emergence of the Sino-Soviet split put communist, radical, and left-leaning revolutions in a bind. As a result of these international debates, two contending factions began to emerge in the VWP, the Vietnam Workers' Party, complicating the already existent power struggles in the Politburo. Although far from homogeneous or static, these heterogeneous factions coalesced around the vital question of reunification. North Firsters wanted to continue concentrating the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's resources on state building, socialist development of the economy that would compete with and ultimately defeat the South. The South Firsters wanted to shepherd the DRV's resources into supporting the rising resistance in the South, reunification through war. The terms of the debate centered on the rate and the methods of the agricultural revolution in the North, but were intimately connected with the insurgency in the South. As the Sino-Soviet rift deepened and the conflict in the South intensified, the opposing factions invoked Khrushchev's peaceful coexistence and Mao's anti-imperialist lines to advance their respective causes. End quote. Lien Hang Nguyen argues that Vo Nguyen Giap and Pham Van Dong and Ho Chi Minh are in the North Firster camp, meaning the socialist revolution, at least around 1960, at the time that, this is a long-standing issue, but around 1960, the socialist revolution is so fragile. And this is in a lot of ways due to that purging that they did for many years after the First Indochina War, where they're consolidating the Communist Party, but getting, incredibly paranoid about who they can trust and what sort of ideological cadres they have in the party. They feel the party is so fragile that if they were to go on the offensive in the South, that it would be a huge mistake. Whereas the counter to that are Les Zuan and Les Duc Tho, who believe that they do need to be aggressive and go on the offensive in the South. And this power struggle, this North First or South First power struggle, colors the next, half decade in the Vietnamese Workers' Party. It's a struggle that, again, like with this Sino-Soviet split, at different points the Soviets might appear to be, more powerful, or the Chinese might. Les Zuan, though, did have a bit of an issue. We've talked about how these different communist cadres kind of come from different backgrounds. Giap, Ho Chi Minh, Trong Chinh, Pham Van Dong, they come from the intellectual brand or the schools. They were taught communism as young men in schools, perhaps maybe in their travels abroad, or, they were trained by the Chinese or the Soviets themselves. Les Zuan and Les Duc Tho come from a background that is very, very different. They were imprisoned by the French throughout the entirety of World War II. And they came to communism in prison. So their experience of it, I guess you could say, is much different. It has a different color to it. It's much rougher. They approach communism because they want to throw out all the oppressors, push them into the sea, whereas, their counterparts are a little bit more intellectual. They think, they talk, they are, a bit more political, right? Guys like Les Zuan, they don't talk to the West. They don't really talk to the Chinese or the Soviets. They are not the, Machiavellian power politics, realpolitik kind of guys. They are revolutionary. They are all action. And they're, perceived to be like rough and tumble kind of characters. And it's just because their background is incredibly different than their opposition in the party. And so when Les Zuan decides he's going to take over or makes an effort to take over the Hanoi Politburo, it doesn't happen without difficulty. You have this political factional split in Hanoi because there's a difference of opinion about the way forward. There's a difference of opinion about which side of the Sino-Soviet split they need to be on. There's also a difference in opinion almost ideologically. Lezuan is much more authoritarian leaning than Ho Chi Minh, Giap, and others. He wants to rule things with an iron fist. He has his own ideas about how the war should go, about how the socialist, party, the experiment should go as well. And they differ from his counterparts. The way that he goes about consolidating his hold on power in the party is to do so through a police state. Lien Hang Nguyen writes, quote, "While he laid the groundwork to usurp revolutionary power in the South, Lezuan constructed a solid foundation to bolster his leadership and gain support for his policies in the North. In order to become the first among equals in the Politburo, Lezuan needed to firm up his base of support within the party so it would not crumble as easily as Trong Chin's had in the wake of the land reform debacle. With the adoption of the party statute on September 15, 1960, one that would remain in place until reunification in 1976, the power hierarchy in the party solidified. The Politburo remained situated at the top, but the role of the first secretary and his secretariat, the executive arm charged with the specific responsibility of solving the daily problems and controlling the carrying out of the Politburo's decisions, became even more important after 1960. End quote. What Lezuan does in 1960 in Hanoi is he almost removes any counterweights to his power within the party. There had always been counterweights. When Vo and Giap is incredibly powerful, there's a counterweight, at least in terms of military decision-making. He's ultimately the face of it, but there is a counterweight. Ho Chi Minh might be the face internationally, and even now in 1960, people think Ho Chi Minh is the guy in charge. He's not. There's no real power, at least outside of what Lezuan, Le Duc Tho, and company want to do. Lien Hang Nguyen gives us the breakdown of this new bureaucracy within the Communist Party in Vietnam. She writes, quote, "Lezuan was able to accomplish what previous leaders of the Politburo could not. With the adoption of the 1960 party statute, Lezuan consolidated decision-making under his leadership by expanding the jurisdiction of the Secretariat over such disparate sectors as propaganda and training, foreign affairs, finance, science and education, and industry and agriculture. Hence, the statute greatly expanded the sway of head apparatchiks in the VWP. Le Duc Tho remained the increasingly important post of chief of the party organizational committee, which dictated the careers and livelihood of all party cadres. The General Political Department of the North Vietnamese Army under Nguyen Chi Thanh was one of the few staff agencies permanently established as a department by the statute. Since 1950, Thanh had acted in this capacity as a light counterweight to Giap. 10 years later, the balance tipped in Thanh's favor. Not only did the GPD ensure that the North Vietnamese armed forces remained under the watchful eye of the party, Thanh was also promoted to full general in September 1959, rendering his rank equal to Giap's. The party's officially sanctioned intellectual Tho Hu continued his surveillance and repression of the intelligentsia as chair of the Education and Propaganda Department. Regarding military affairs, Lezuan made sure to appoint men in the party's military decision-making group, the CMC, which had long eclipsed the state's National Defense Council. Actual decision-making for the war, however, resided within the Politburo subcommittee that included Lezuan and Le Duc Tho. Lezuan's party leadership during the war was a complex structure that involved multiple committees nominally performing the same tasks. This arrangement allowed the first secretary to undercut his opponents by getting them mired in powerless committees while he stood at the center of the key decision-making bodies in Hanoi." End quote. Just like the Americans are terrified of expanding the war in Vietnam, in the early 1960s, decision makers in Hanoi are equally terrified of expanding the war with the South Vietnamese government. And they have to play off the Soviets and the Chinese, who are scared about, just the same way the Americans are scared of fighting the Chinese or the Soviets if they expand the war in Vietnam. The inverse is also true. So Vietnam has to appear as though they're not being incredibly aggressive or too aggressive for the tastes of the Chinese or the Soviets, while also being aggressive enough. They don't want to start an all-out nuclear war. They don't want to start World War III, but they've also got to, create conditions to force the Americans out, or to defeat, in their aims, to defeat the South Vietnamese government. At that point, the Diem government. And these two factions kind of become the loudest voices about what they should do for it. Should we rebuild the North, or should we go all out in the South? Ultimately, I think something worth noting is that it's something I remember reading in the Pentagon Papers. While the Americans in Operation Rolling Thunder are bombing all of these, factories or places where the war effort can be continued for North Vietnam, while they're bombing all these places that appear like they, on paper, would allow the Vietnamese to continue the war effort. They make trucks or planes or bullets or whatever. They create supplies that they can use to continue the war. While the United States are bombing all these places, the war effort isn't changing. They are not impacting Vietnam's ability to wage war. And it's confusing to U.S. policymakers in the early 1960s because they're like, wait a minute. We are destroying the North's infrastructure and nothing is changing. Why is nothing changing? And this is where the North first or South first argument kind of comes to the fore, because they are getting all of their ability to wage war from the Soviets and the Chinese. So if you build up the North's infrastructure, it might get bombed by the United States, but also, do you even need it? That's what Le Duan might argue. Do you even need to continue building up the socialist economy in the North? Because on the one hand, the United States might bomb it into the Stone Age, and on the other hand, the Soviets and Chinese are providing all the material and weapons that you need to continue the war. All the Vietnamese have to provide is the manpower, which they have in spades. And because of their ideological leanings, they can press soldiers into service, no problem. So Le Duan thinks we have all we need to push the war in the South, which is ultimately what, while straddling this line between the Sino and the Sino-Soviet split, he decides we're going to press the war in the South. This split is so interesting to me because we've talked ad nauseum, I feel like, about this Western idea that communism is this, homogenous boogeyman block in the East. That the Soviets and the Chinese and the Vietnamese and, the Pathet Lao and everyone else, the Cambodians, they're all going to operate with this hive mind. They're going to have a centered ideological leaning around a singular figure or a singular party, and that party or figure is going to dictate policy for the entire party as a whole. And based on what I've been reading, my understanding is that Stalin at points when he was in charge was the cult of personality for the entire communist ideological revolution throughout the world. He's dictating policy for the French communists, for the American communists, for communists everywhere. And so if that is your singular data point, your only North Star or lodestone for information about the Communist Party, yeah, it would make sense. They're all going to operate with a hive mind. But once Stalin is gone, 1953, Stalin dies. The Soviets look at where Russia is, and they decide they're going to move away in the Soviet Union from Stalinization. Nikita Khrushchev delivers a speech at one point that kind of rocks the entire communist world, because in this speech, he's denouncing Stalin's cult of personality. And communists the world over kind of start to shiver a little bit. It would be the equivalent almost, and this is an odd comparison, but, take it for what it's worth. It would be the equivalent of somebody now in the United States denouncing George Washington as being too fill in the blank, like radical or denouncing all the ideas that our founding fathers had because of fill in the blank reason, for any number of reasons, right? Obviously, the situation is very different. So it's not a great example, but that's the sense that I get from reading about this, that Khrushchev denouncing Stalin shocks everyone because Stalin is kind of the lodestone for the communist ideological movement. It then kicks off a whole debate about, well, now if Stalinization is not what the Soviets want to do, if they want to move away from that, what is the lodestone for the communist movement? And that ends up being the central conflict within the Sino-Soviet split, because in Beijing, Mao Zedong holds very firmly to Stalinist communist ideas. He is building up the Chinese Communist Party around the cult of personality of Mao in much a similar way that Stalin built up the Communist Party in Russia around himself. Khrushchev and then later Brezhnev move away from this idea of what Stalin was and change Soviet Russia completely. It creates a very interesting scenario, though, for smaller countries receiving aid from the Soviets, from the Chinese. Because if you're the Hanoi Politburo right now, you're receiving aid from both of them. And they are, the parents are arguing. And the kids are just kind of sitting in the middle of it, scratching their heads, trying to figure out what to do. They've got to appease both parents. You don't want to pit the parents against one another, but you also still want your parents to love you. So if the Soviets send aid to Hanoi, is Hanoi going to denounce the Soviets as revisionists, the way the Chinese are? Or are they going to accept that aid because, yeah, we need the aid. We're not going to turn it away. We're not going to look a gift horse in the mouth over some, arguments about Stalinization. But also at different points, Soviet Russia or China kind of dictates world policy on communism. And so it's kind of like when the parents are having the arguments and one appears to be winning the arguments at one point or another, and the kids have to align themselves with the winning side. You want to pick the winning horse. But it's not so simple as that either, because for Lezuan and the Hanoi Politburo, they have to straddle this line. They have to straddle this Sino-Soviet divide. You see this in speeches given at different plenums. Lezuan gave a speech in 1964 where he is straddling the line between the Soviets and the Chinese. Lian Hengwin says this about that speech, quote, "The first secretary claimed that those who placed peaceful coexistence with imperialists above all else were hampering the development of the revolution. In contrast, the Vietnamese leader applauded Mao's contribution to the development of Marxist-Leninist theory, in which the Chinese leader emphasized the role of the peasantry, the establishment of rural bases, the encirclement of cities by villages, and protracted armed struggle. Although the VWP was now, if only temporarily, in the Chinese camp, its published resolution steered clear of overtly offending the Soviet Union by not explicitly calling Khrushchev or the CPSU revisionists. With the acceleration and expansion of the war, Lezuan did not want to close off the option of more Soviet aid." End quote. While the Sino-Soviet split is making life difficult in Hanoi, the Central Highlands, south of the DMZ, become this place that the NVA and the United States military start almost playing tag with each other. It is a spot where, if you're William Westmoreland, you look at it and say, we need to clear out the NVA using this search and destroy tactic to kind of clear them out. The NVA also are starting to get a pretty good sense of how the United States wants to fight. We've now had contact for several years. They've figured out how these things tend to go. It is so interesting because I think in a lot of ways this conflict is defined by disagreement. You have disagreement in Hanoi about if they're going to operate in a Western sort of sense or in the guerrilla sense that they did in the First Indochina War. You've also got disagreement on the United States part of this because, and it's almost even hard to have a conversation about this because nobody really understood the kind of war they were fighting at the time. And there's several reasons for this because it's different than any other type of conflict, right? There's no contiguous road system. It changes things when you can't move your troops up and down, the country in trucks and things like you have to adjust how you're going to move men and munitions from place to place. It is why you see the helicopter become so important because it turns your men and munitions mobile. You can move them from place to place, drop them in, and then, head out. William Westmoreland has a quote where he's talking about the conflict afterward in his memoirs. And in generals' memoirs, generally, no pun intended, they are trying to shape the narrative to kind of be the most positive look at their own experience in the war. And William Westmoreland's memoirs say this, quote, "We are fighting a war with no front lines, since the enemy hides among the people in the jungles and mountains and uses covertly border areas of neutral countries. One cannot measure our progress by lines on a map." End quote. You almost get the sense he is redefining the terms of engagement, I guess, or he's trying to negotiate with Washington, hey, here's how I think we need to fight this war, whereas Washington's tell him, you need to fight it a different way. I can only imagine what it's like to be a soldier fighting on the ground, because I think that is initially what has me so intrigued about this subject is I had a great uncle that fought in Vietnam, and when he came home, at least what my family said of him was, he almost shed his skin and came home as just a different human being, wearing the same face, but just a completely different person. And I remember reading his letters that he would write home, and he would say things like, "I can't wait to be human again." That is the part of this conflict that, everything is moving and changing in such a rapid way, and the style of fighting has to almost adopt a completely new tenor. What does that do to the soldiers on the ground when you're having to fight in this smash and dash kind of way that changes how everything goes? The Vietnamese get incredibly good at, making up for their deficiencies with these guerrilla-style tactics where they show up, fire maybe a mortar round or two, or have laid a booby trap already previously that United States soldiers run into, or show up, fire a few rounds from your AKs, and then dash back off into the brush, creating this scenario where repeatedly, over and over and over again, United States soldiers are having contact with the enemy, and they're being put in a situation where they can't really retaliate. They can't create that cause and effect where they feel like there's actually a result to them being there. It creates this paranoia, this ubiquitous fear. That's one of those things that I just wonder, what is that like? What is it like to be so afraid all the time that around every corner there's the enemy? Tim O'Brien writes about this feeling that soldiers have towards peasants. He says, quote, "In May, we were ordered back, inserted by chopper in the villages of Murky. A few thousand meters south of the My Lais, we hit immediate contact. The Viet Cong were there, waiting in ambush across the paddy. The people of Murky 3 were silent. They let us walk into the ambush. not a word of warning, end quote. This is the thing that you find over and over again when reading about this, is that soldiers are suspicious of villagers because they feel like villagers know where the booby traps are. They know where the VC are, because they feel like anytime they go into a village, there's no, young men or middle-aged men. It's all women, children, and old people. So they think, where's all the young men? And, they're not there. They can't communicate with the villagers there, so they think they're VC. Nick Terse writes about this in his book, Kill Anything That Moves. He writes, quote, now quoting a veteran, "You go into a village, and there was never a man in a village. Never," said another. Now Terse writes, "To Americans, the reason was obvious. The missing men, all the village's sons and husbands, were Viet Cong guerrillas. This was, of course, one definite possibility, but it was also quite possible that the men were serving in the U.S. allied South Vietnamese forces, or were draft dodgers hiding from armies of both sides." He continues later, "Many U.S. soldiers were also suspicious because South Vietnamese villagers always seemed to know where to walk to avoid VC booby traps. This wasn't really true. Civilians were also, in fact, killed or wounded by such weapons. But to the soldiers, the fact that the peasants didn't warn them about these dangers was more clear evidence that the locals were supporting the VC, if not members themselves." He continues, "The soldiers also had trouble sorting out who was who. Troops often got only fleeting glimpses of figures dressed in the loose-fitting black pajamas, which in the countryside were actually worn by men and women, young and old, civilians and guerrillas alike. From a distance, a black-clad female farmer with a hoe could be indistinguishable from a male fighter with a rifle. Unable to readily tell friend from foe, and often unwilling to take the risk of trying to do so, many troops simply decided to fire on anyone they saw, and they often did so without the tacit support or an explicit order from superiors." End quote. One of the things that's so ubiquitous in a scenario like this, and also so difficult to kind of put into words, is just the mental state of soldiers fighting in a war like this. You don't know who your enemy are. You're being mortared constantly. There's this fear that, like, anytime you move, you're going to step on a mine, or if you move too quickly in a certain place, that you're going to be sniped or shot or blown up or whatever. And you almost just have to live with it, normalize it. There's the constant fear of getting shot, of, whatever. Tim O'Brien writes about what it is like to be shot and the feeling and the despair that kind of comes along with it. He writes, quote, "The stiff thump of the bullet, like a fist, the way it knocks the air out of you and makes you cough. How the sound of the gunshot arrived about 10 years later, and the dizzy feeling, the smell of yourself, the things you think about and say and do right afterward. The way your eyes focus on a tiny white pebble or blade of grass, and how you start thinking, oh man, that's the last thing I'll ever see, that pebble, that blade of grass, which makes you want to cry." End quote. You also have this kind of thing where society tells you that killing is really bad. And so when you go overseas to a whole nother place and you're with these half-deranged other men that are constantly afraid, that are, getting shot, blown up, all these things, it puts you in a mental state that is tenuous at best. And you are reckoning with everything that you were taught growing up sort of crumbling away. And what does that do to your mental state? It's so difficult to kind of put into specific words these feelings that are like, it's just so difficult to quantify, right? These are oftentimes 18, 19, 20-year-olds that their entire life they grew up, let's say they grew up in the Midwest, and life is quiet and you go to church and you're taught to love one another. And then you go to Vietnam and you're taught to hate. You're taught through experience that people want to kill you and therefore you want to kill them. And your entire time in boot camp, you're taught that the Vietnamese are even less than human. Because, your sergeants want to make it easier for you to kill them when you have to actually pull the trigger. But then when you do pull the trigger and you see, the body crumple on the other end of your bullet, you have this mixed emotion of elation because you've saved yourself and your friends, but also at the same time, you have this like mental fragmentation because you've just done the unthinkable. You've committed the cardinal sin because your entire society is built around the preservation of life and you've just taken it. What does that do to the soldiers on the ground? Not to mention the other ways that you can kind of salve these mental anguishes that you're feeling with drugs or women or whatever else. Bill Earhart writes in his memoir about a soldier that couldn't take it anymore, and he snapped. He writes, quoting this person, "My wife's divorcing me. My best friend knocked her up. She wants to marry him." He continues, "Nobody knew what to say. In the awkward silence that followed, Calloway crumpled up the letter, let it drop listlessly at his feet, reached up to the cartridge belt hanging from a nail above his cot, pulled out his .45, chambered around, put the barrel to his temple, and pulled the trigger before any of us understood what we were seeing." End quote. You get also this general feeling of isolation even amongst troops separated from their commanders. Because as Nick Turse says in his book, Kill Anything That Moves, quote, "Generals and colonels weren't out in the field, dirty, hungry, and dehydrated, slogging through mud, muck, and water, each step an ordeal, day after day, sometimes for weeks on end, until their feet swelled and the skin painfully sloughed off in silver dollar-sized chunks. The commanders didn't come down with constant bacterial infections, suffer oozing sores, crotch rot, and other fungal infections. They didn't have to burn off leeches and face heat exhaustion while being bitten by fire ants and eaten alive by mosquitoes. They sat back at the base or soared high above it all in helicopters, micromanaging from the sky. Who were they to prescribe rules about firing on villages? Who were they to demand additional risks from troops who'd had it tough enough as it was?" End quote. This is the kind of situation that we enter into in the Central Highlands in late 1967. Anytime military command got word of located NVA units, they all got excited because the NVA are almost mythical. The VC are everywhere and nowhere all at once, but the NVA, the better trained, the better equipped, they're hidden, almost difficult to place your finger on a map. And when they are found and located, everybody gets really excited about the potential contact that's to come. Bill Earhart writes about how mythical almost the NVA forces are. He writes, quote, "I'd been hearing about the mythical North Vietnamese army ever since I'd arrived in Vietnam, but I'd never actually seen or engaged them. With the exception of the operation which had cost Bobby Rowe his life, an operation I hadn't gone on, we'd thus far been fighting the Viet Cong. The VC had two types of forces, the ragtag farmer by day, fighter by night guerrilla bands, and the more organized main force units, both consisting of men and women recruited in South Vietnam. The NVA, on the other hand, were reportedly much better equipped and better trained, and operated in units much more like the conventional companies, battalions, and regiments deployed by the Americans and ARVN." End quote. Military command gets word that NVA units have occupied Hill 875 near the base Dak To, and so they send U.S. troops to engage them there. The NVA had arrived a couple of weeks beforehand, and they dug in. They built trenches and tunnels and other things like that. I ran across a testimony from a North Vietnamese soldier who's on Hill 875 after the United States shells it. And he said the hill was barren. There was no trees left. It was a wasteland. Reminds me of the fields of Verdun. You know, it's just pockmarked, and there used to be a forest and it's completely gone. Same kind of thing here with Hill 875. It serves a couple purposes. One, you know, you have better visibility because all the trees are gone. So from the air, you can theoretically better see what's actually happening on the ground. And two, hopefully you've cleared out the Vietnamese while they're there. The problem is they've dug in, so they're just fine. 3 companies of Americans move up the hill. They're in kind of this straight line moving through the narrow, you know, passes as they kind of cut them out of the mountainside. And the Vietnamese are at the top of the hill in their trenches just waiting. You can imagine the pregnant pause as soldiers are slowly moving up the hill towards the entrenchments. For several hours, it's dead quiet, nothing happening. You can just hear the sound of, you know, the flora and the fauna. And then out of nowhere, thousands of rounds of ammunition explode, guns go off, mortars go off. Everything kind of erupts in this intense crescendo as the Vietnamese hop out of their trenches and start firing on the Americans, who have no clue they're there. They get within 5 meters of the trenches before the Vietnamese shoot at them. And it reminds me of the Revolutionary War quote, you know, don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes. And they're doing it with AK-47s, Chinese grenades. It's blistering. It's terrible. The Americans are destroyed. And then meanwhile, another unit of NVA soldiers circles around behind the 3 companies and hits them from the back. So they're penned in from the front, from the back, and they're eviscerated. Small pockets of Americans scrambled to try and make little fighting holes where they could hunker down and, you know, resist the siege. And it turns from this, you know, hot-blooded dash as you're trying to scramble for a cover into a bit of a siege. For 2 weeks, soldiers are pinned down there, and if you can imagine, it's on the news back home. They are, you know, news anchors have, there's a clip where news anchors have this topographical map, and they're just pointing out soldiers are right here, the NVA are right here, they're pinned down here. And again, I'm trying to wrap my mind around this as I'm saying it, because it's so foreign, right? Just getting the breakdown at home, the post-game interview, or I guess the halftime interview, right? It's still going on. Soldiers huddle together in a clearing while American artillery and napalm peppers the enemy positions. And it turns into an oven for them too, where their trenches are completely covered in napalm. Men are on fire. I read a quote where a Vietnamese said that his officer was burning like a dragon. One plane flies in and its first bomb hits NVA positions, obliterating them. And then the second bomb is incorrectly placed and it lands on U.S. troops. 40 soldiers die almost instantly. And there's a quote where a lieutenant grabs a radio, radios back to the back and says, quote, "No more fucking planes, you're hitting us now too," end quote. Relief forces finally arrive, and of, the first company that made contact with the Vietnamese, there were 140 soldiers in that company initially. 26 of them survived, and all of them were wounded. Help arrives, and the NVA slip away into Laos and Cambodia. Again, after all this, you really have nothing to show for it. No captured enemy. They kind of just melt away into the jungle. Dak To is a battle that is one of the most costly in the entire war, and it is, I think, so emblematic in a lot of ways of what the conflict is like. You get hit hard, then you retaliate and theoretically give as good as you got, but even still the enemy slips away. Dak To is a mess. In a lot of ways, though, it's a microcosm of the entire conflict because the Americans after Dak To claim victory. But if you look at, how it all went on the ground, they claim victory because the Vietnamese withdrew. They claim victory because when push comes to shove, the Americans can bring to bear more artillery, more troops than the Vietnamese can. But did they win? It seems like when you look at the conflict on the ground, they get their butts kicked. They just are able to rally and bring more to bear. And, eventually, when it comes down to it, they retake Hill 875. But realistically, they only take Hill 875 because the Vietnamese have withdrawn and gone into Cambodia and Laos. That is somewhat of a microcosm of the whole thing because, yes, the Americans win. Yes, they claim to have killed 4 times more Vietnamese than they lost, which is probably true. But they're holed up at Hill 875. They are ambushed. And you have multiple companies that just get decapitated. It's also the kind of conflict where you can win, but because these battles are on the news back home and people are getting to see, oh, our guys are getting destroyed over there, public perception will turn on a dime that way too. I ran across a quote in doing research, and I wish I could remember the name of the person who said this, but essentially their argument was Americans cannot abide a loser. How much of that is factored into this public perception shift back home, where not only are you seeing your boys get hurt, you're seeing your friends get shot at, this sort of thing. You're seeing that on the news. But how much of it is just, we're not winning. Why are we there? And then you start asking questions. What is the purpose of the conflict? And the questions are getting answers that aren't necessarily as conclusive as you'd like. Your president is saying, just trust me. I promise you it's important. Communism is bad. But then you start asking questions even further than that. You start pressing. And the answer you're getting back is just trust me. And trust has begun to erode. Just like the men on the ground, people back home want an appreciable cause and effect. They want to see, if we do this, if we input this is the output that we're going to get. It does, as Robert McNamara would like to say, it does have this, spreadsheet sort of quality. I want an input to give me a certain output. But the problem is war is not just conducted that way. I think there's a famous saying about war that war never survives, or the battle plan never survives first contact, right? But in a war of attrition like this, all of your battle plans, you go in, you say, we're just going to sweep them out. Then, you lose several companies of men. You lose 15 guys in smaller conflicts. You lose 5 guys in smash and dash kinds of things. All of these build up to one another. And while you might move the Vietnamese away from the position that they've initially taken, what have you actually gained? It's this stalemate that makes Le Duan think the time is ripe for his grand strategy to be brought out of the drawer. Le Duan had this idea about how the war should be conducted that pretty much maintained throughout the entire conflict. He called his strategy General Offensive, General Uprising, or GOGU for short. This idea was an idea that you marry big unit warfare, or your conventional NVA units, you attack everywhere all at once, and you marry their efforts with VC efforts, Viet Cong efforts, and you have guerrilla forces partner up with your NVA forces and just overwhelm every major city in Vietnam. In this case, you would focus on the Central Highlands, you would focus on Saigon, and you would overtake the South Vietnamese government. Theoretically, while you're also doing this, if you overtook the South Vietnamese government, you would push the United States out, and you would win the war all in one fell swoop. This idea, though, was not without its own detractors in the Hanoi Politburo. Le Duan had control over the Politburo, but that's not to say that he had unanimous support for this general offensive, general uprising idea. Remember, there is this Sino-Soviet split going on, and along with this split, there is a North First and South First split in the Hanoi Politburo. This is definitively a South First, idea. Not only are there detractors within the Hanoi Politburo, there's detractors from without as well. At this point, at the end of 1967, the Chinese have hundreds of thousands of troops in North Vietnam. You don't see them because they're not actually doing the fighting, but they're there just in case things escalate to a point that China has to step in. They're building roads, they're doing infrastructure, projects, things like that, railroads, roads, things of that nature. They're there. They're the silent majority, as it were. But Mao feels that because he's got several 100,000 Chinese troops in North Vietnam, he can dictate what North Vietnam's going to do. And there's like this push and pull because the Soviets are giving just as much, if not maybe a little bit more aid to the Hanoi Politburo than the Chinese are. So the Soviets feel like they can also dictate what the Hanoi Politburo is going to do just as much as China feels like they can dictate what the Hanoi Politburo is going to do. More than anything else, though, China is really the hand behind the curtain that is helping the Vietnamese transport material from north to south along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So when it comes down to it, Mao feels like he can really dictate what the North Vietnamese want to do. And what does Mao want them to do? He wants them to continue a guerrilla struggle. This is something that Vo and Giap really tried to do well in the First Indochina War, and he struggled in phase 2. Remember, there's 3 phases. You have the general guerrilla phase, you have a stasis phase where you're trying to just kind of maintain as things kind of intensify, and then you have the general counteroffensive. Giap really struggled with phase 2. He was really good at the guerrilla part, and they were pretty darn good at the general counteroffensive part. You saw that with Dien Bien Phu. But it's the middle part where you're transitioning from guerrilla warfare to general counteroffensive where the Vietnamese struggled. They struggled because they were outgunned and in a lot of ways just weren't able to do big unit warfare with the French the way that they would later be able to against the Americans. Mao and the North Firsters also are proponents of opening up negotiations to end the war. I mean, think about it from their perspective, right? This war has gone, to this point, better than anybody thought it could have. Worst case scenarios that the Americans roll through Hanoi and overtake the North Vietnamese government, clear everyone out, kill people responsible, flush the whole thing down the drain, right? But that hasn't happened. If anything, you've reached a stasis point, which Beijing feels like everything is up from here. Let's just keep this thing going and wear them out because we know, what do we know? We know the Vietnamese are not going to give up easy. They're going to give up everything dearly. That's what they've been doing so far. And Beijing feels like, let's just keep it going. How much longer can the Americans continue to do this? There's rumblings from the United States and protests and draft dodgers, and the American public are becoming fed up with this entire war. Let's just see how much longer they can do it. Le Duan, on the other hand, does not want to do this. He wants to have a decisive stroke that wins the war. And while China and Mao Zedong have their own ideas for how the war should be conducted, There are people inside the Hanoi Politburo that think very similarly to Mao, that say we should open up negotiations. We should continue this fighting in stasis. But Lezuan says that's not going to happen. One of the foremost dissenters of his South First Plan, his General Offensive, General Uprising Plan, is Huang Min-chin. He wrote a 200-page report titled Dogmatism in Vietnam that criticized the lack of openness and democracy within the party. Huang Min-chin realized and said out loud that Lezuan had overtaken the party, and whatever Lezuan said was what the party did. Chin thought this was bad overall for the party and distributed his bulletin that criticized Lezuan. This, what happens next, is written about by Vuong Quang Xuan. He says about Chin and what happens to him, quote, "A bulletin written by Chin had been seized and was considered proof of his treason. The bulletin took a position against Resolution 9, which stated that the situation in South Vietnam was now favorable for the use of military means to overthrow the government of South Vietnam, and that the party would not use political means only to achieve victory. It asked for the full support of all North Vietnamese cadres and people in this effort. Chin's bulletin opposed North Vietnamese military participation in the liberation of South Vietnam," end quote. Le Duc Tho then wrote a missive of his own, and in this missive he justifies the arrest of many of what he would call traitors to the Politburo. He wrote, quote, "These traitors have sowed dissension within the party and undermined the unity of our army. Their underhanded activities are evident. Their purpose is to organize a faction to oppose our party, the Workers' Party. They have deliberately made inaccurate analyses, partial critiques, and mischievous evaluations in the Politburo with the intention of fomenting friction between party leaders. They have gained the allegiance of a number of high-ranking cadres of various ministries, even those of a foreign country. They have sought methods of stealing our confidential documents. They have taken advantage of our cadres' carelessness to collect classified information on our military plans, economic projects, and on foreign aid provided to us by friendly countries for our national salvation against the U.S. aggression. They have tried to hinder our counterattack of the enemy. They have tried to prevent Cosvin from implementing Resolution 9. They have assumed that in the last 20 years of our party lines and policies have been affected by dogmatism, and that our plan of opposing the U.S. for national salvation is short-sighted," end quote. Those traitors that were arrested were placed in the Hanoi Hilton, in the prison called Ho Lo. Lien Hang Nguyen writes about the situation, quote, "It is unlikely that these individuals posed an actual threat to national security. Although the revisionist anti-party affair had its origins in the controversial 1963 plenum and would have legal and political repercussions for the DRV beyond 1968 and even 1975, the immediate rationale for the arrests in 1967 rested squarely on the Politburo's choice of tactics and strategy for the Tet Offensive," end quote. It's not only lower-ranking members of the party that are purged, it's also high-ranking rivals of Lezuan that are purged as well. Vo and Zap ends up going to Europe. Ho Chi Minh goes to China for medical treatment. And the head of Cosvin, Tan, collapsed and died of a heart attack just before the Tet Offensive was supposed to get underway. The stakes of an attack like this are everything. At this point in time, there are nearly 500,000 American troops in Vietnam. You have nearly 350,000 ARVN troops. You've also got about 285,000 supplemental allied troops from other countries around the world. You have roughly, according to Max Hastings, 1.2 million troops that Lezuan and Hanoi need to defeat in this general offensive, general uprising masterstroke. And they're planning on doing it with what Lezoin thinks are going to be about 500,000 troops that will answer his call. There will be NVA traditional units that will swarm down on the major cities and urban centers, and he believes that Kozvin will call upon, some several 100,000 guerrillas and local people that will partner with the NVA units and will take the fight to these major cities and urban centers, culminating with a defeat of the South Vietnamese government in Saigon. That's the plan, anyway. Funny enough, William Westmoreland and military command in Saigon knew something was coming. They just didn't know what. Intelligence picked up signs of a buildup in 1967, late 1967 and early 68. They just didn't know what it all meant. You have fragmented pieces of the puzzle. They just don't fit together really well. And so you're kind of left asking questions about what it means. William Westmoreland interprets the signs and the wonders as evidence that there was going to be an attack at Khe Sanh. Khe Sanh was a base just south of the demilitarization zone, the DMZ. There was about 6,000 Marines at Khe Sanh, and it was in a relatively remote spot. So if you've been paying attention, your alarm bell should be going off. This sounds a lot like Dien Bien Phu. I think that's what Westmoreland sees, what Lyndon Johnson sees, what everyone sees. They're thinking if the Vietnamese did it once, they'll do it again. They're thinking that the NVA want to lure the United States into a position in a remote base where they'll have a huge conventional battle and they'll sway public opinion and also the course of the war in one battle. So Westmoreland zeroes in on Khe Sanh as the place where this next attack, whatever it ends up being, is going to come from. South Vietnamese intelligence noted that what they were hearing was that whatever this attack was going to be, it was going to happen during the new year, during Tet. Westmoreland interpreted that to mean that whatever was going to happen during Tet, if something was going to happen during Tet, it was going to be some sort of diversion for whatever the main assault was going to be, which he believed would come at Khe Sanh. This then begins a period where MACV orders the resupply of Khe Sanh to an insane extent to where there's planes coming and going constantly. Their ability to resupply at the base at Khe Sanh is almost unlimited. They can keep it going for however long they want. And Westmoreland's beliefs are reinforced when there's reports of bombardment at Khe Sanh. Now, this bombardment, it's not a active shelling. It's almost like a shelling to just keep them occupied. But Westmoreland holds firmly to the belief that this shelling, this bombardment means more's coming in the future. That they're just sighting things in, getting their guns ready to go for when the real thing happens. And if you remember, this is somewhat what happened at Dien Bien Phu. They sight things in for a while, and then the real bombardment happens, and all of a sudden everything happens very, very quickly. The legend of Westmoreland kind of dies here with this offensive because, as Westmoreland will say in his memoirs later, which, again, it must be mentioned, all of these generals write memoirs, and in these memoirs, it's a bit like a propaganda piece trying to salvage their reputation and save face. Westmoreland is doing this just like every other general. In the history of losing efforts ever has done, he's trying to tell you he knew the communists were doing something. And in some ways he probably did. He knew there was something coming. He just had no clue what that something was going to be, where it was going to happen, and how it was going to come about. Ultimately, nothing happens at Khe Sanh. I think something like 6 weeks after the Tet Offensive begins, Khe Sanh is abandoned because everybody realizes nothing's going to happen there. It was never a real target in the offensive. but it just so happens about 100 other cities and fortified places were. Michael Hare, in his book Dispatches, writes about how everybody's feeling when the Tet Offensive begins. Also try to think, too, about the correspondents, the people that are reporting on the war, and how they are so surprised, worn down, exhausted by news filtering into Saigon from other places throughout Vietnam about attacks here, attacks there, and just the sense of hopelessness that you feel as everything feels like it's caving in from above you. Michael Hare writes about it, quote, "We took a huge collective nervous breakdown. It was the compression and heat of heavy contact generated out until every American in Vietnam got a taste. Vietnam was a dark room full of deadly objects. The VC were everywhere all at once like spider cancer. And instead of losing the war in little pieces over years, we lost it fast in under a week. After that, we were like the character in pop grunt mythology, dead but too dumb to lie down. Our worst dread of yellow peril became realized. We saw them now dying by the thousands all over the country, and yet they didn't seem depleted, let alone exhausted, as the mission was claiming by the fourth day." End quote. This dread filters down everywhere. It's not just the correspondents, it's the men on the ground, it's decision makers at military command. Michael Hare writes about a guy at Khe Sanh who goes insane, and it's a story that kind of becomes famous and filters down everywhere. Michael Hare writes, quote, "One afternoon at Khe Sanh, a Marine opened the door of a latrine and was killed by a grenade that had been rigged on the door. The command tried to blame it on a North Vietnamese infiltrator, but the grunts knew what had happened. Like a gook is really going to tunnel all the way in here to booby-trap a shithouse, right? Some guy just flipped out is all." End quote. It's this oppressive feeling that filters down everywhere. Reading Michael Hare, you're reading about, like, he sees all the bodies that he's witnessed throughout his time in Vietnam. There's this pall almost, and it's hard almost to describe because it's pervasive and it's a smell. It's a thing physical, right? This despair that everyone begins to feel. As it happens, Khe Sanh is meant to be a diversion. The diversion that William Westmoreland thinks all the other attacks are, where he thinks that other attacks are a diversion for the eventual attack at Khe Sanh. Turns out Khe Sanh is a diversion for the real attacks because the National Liberation Front, the NVA, dispatched 2 divisions to Khe Sanh to take the United States' attention away from where they really want to go, Hue. Hue is kind of a representative seat of Vietnamese culture. It's the cultural home of the Vietnamese people, the former imperial capital of the Nguyen dynasty, up until 1945 when the Japanese arrive on the scene. It's incredibly important, and it's also symbolic. So for the Hanoi Politburo, if you're going to liberate the South, one of the ways you can do that is by taking back Hue from the imperial overlords. There's buildup around Hue from January 25th to January 30th, 1968. But January 29th and 30th, throughout all of Vietnam, attacks are taking place at Da Nang. There's buildup around Saigon. There's also attacks at Dak To, Kon Tum, Nha Sang, Ban Mi Thuot, Dalat, and Pleiku. The main points of attack, though, were Da Nang, Saigon, and Hue. These were considered the 3 most important cities and places where the Hanoi Politburo could establish a foothold and then slowly chip away at the South Vietnamese government and eventually win back the entire country. Westmoreland and his staff don't believe that this is a Vietnamese war, though, which is probably one of the main issues with Westmoreland's command of troops in Vietnam, is because he believes it's an American war. Max Hastings writes, quote, Westmoreland and his staff, convinced that this was an American war, discounted the notion that the communists might make South Vietnamese forces their principal targets. Westmoreland is thinking all the attacks are going to happen at American bases, while the Vietnamese are not so much worried about American bases as much as they are worried about Vietnamese cities. But the attack doesn't necessarily go off as easy as Le Duan would have wanted. Due to all the secrecy and the political infighting in Hanoi about the Tet Offensive, about what was going to happen in the way forward, orders didn't filter out to all the different places in Vietnam until the last possible minute. Co Vinh, the place in the Central Highlands from where all VC operations were coordinated, didn't get word about the Tet attacks until 3 days before they were supposed to happen. In fact, there's a story where the two leaders of Co Vinh are hanging out, smoking cigarettes, drinking liquor, when a courier shows up and says, or hands them a missive from the Politburo that says, you're attacking in 3 days. And they immediately depart for Saigon. And they get there in, I think, 24, 30 hours or something. And they assemble all the cadres and they say, we're going to attack Saigon tonight. And all the cadres are freaking out going, oh my God, how are we going to possibly coordinate an attack by tonight? As they are marching towards Saigon, they're gathering more cadres. It's kind of like the People's Army kind of a thing. They're all listening to the radio to listen for reports of, they're asking questions like, hey, can you clarify this point of confusion, which the entire thing is a point of confusion. Nobody seems to know exactly what's happening around Vietnam. It's chaos. Max Hastings has a section about this portion of the Tet Offensive, and he's just titled it Fugue. And I think that's a great description because not only are the Americans in fugue about what's actually happening, the Vietnamese themselves are in a bit of a fugue state because they can't communicate with Hanoi, nor can they really communicate with NVA troops throughout all of Vietnam. They're kind of every man for themselves. Here's your orders. Go attack this place. Best of luck. The orders for the NVA troops that are meant to attack Hue, they get a very, very simple missive that just says laconically, mount a general offensive and uprising to liberate Hue. That's it. The actual nuts and bolts, the tactics about how you're going to get that done, figure it out. General Tran Do, who exercised political command of the VC Tet operations, said, according to Max Hastings, quote, the curse of their war effort was too much ideological theorizing and too little hard-headed military planning, end quote. January 29th and 30th, there's a buildup of NVA troops at Hue. The commander of the front is General Dang Kin, and he later wrote about the attack on Hue. This attack it's hard to understate how important this is for the entire Tet Offensive. The attack on Hue is in many ways like the soul of this entire offensive. What would it mean for the Vietnamese to take back Hue? It means a lot of things. It's in some respects equivalent to losing Washington, D.C. for Americans. When the British burned down Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812, it's a huge deal. It means a lot. It's never really been, captured and held by foreign forces, maybe outside of that war in 1812. But imagine somebody had overtaken Washington, D.C. Imagine that for 30 years, an enemy has held Washington, D.C. And maybe you have a resistance force that's contained to, one side of the Mississippi River or something like that, and you need to go recapture the rest of the United States. Taking Washington, D.C. would be a very big deal. It would mean a lot for your invasion, for the morale of your troops to go and take back a city that means so much to your country. That's Hue. So multiple divisions move to take Hue, and they are paired with Viet Cong troops. All of these troops are commanded by General Dang Kin. He writes later about when the attack begins, January 30th, 1968. He says, quote, "Finally, throughout the city arose the sound of gunfire, scattered at first, and then as if touched off by a fuse, it rose rapidly to a din." Max Hastings continues his quote saying, "By the time the shooting stopped, the attacking force, having suffered only a few casualties, had dealt Hue's defenders a crushing surprise blow." End quote. This attack at Hue is a surprise attack. There's some ARVN forces inside the city that are subdued, but there's also American forces on the way from the base at Phu Bai, which is not far away from the city of Hue. Bill Earhart was among those who came up from Phu Bai to Hue to relieve the ARVN forces there. Earhart writes, quote, "We loaded into the trucks, and the trucks rumbled into the darkness up Highway 1 toward Hue, 8 miles north. Less than an hour after we had awakened, with dawn just breaking, the convoy entered the south side of the city, the silhouettes of 2- and 3-story buildings visible ahead of us. We passed a Shell gasoline station, and then all hell broke loose. Enemy soldiers dug in close by on either side of the road, behind walls and inside buildings and on rooftops, let loose a withering fusillade that struck against the sleepy convoy with the force of a sledgehammer crushing a cockroach. Automatic weapons, small arms, rockets, recoilless rifles, mortars, grenades, everything, all at once. Men began to scream and topple over in the trucks before we could even return fire. Orders and shouts broke off in mid-sentence as hands flew to faces attached to heads already snapping back by the impact of bullets. Marines scrambled pell-mell out of the trucks, diving wildly for anything that offered cover. The noise drowned everything, even your own thoughts. I lay in a ditch, pushing the barrel of my rifle up over the low top and firing wildly, not daring to look for a target, only trying to make somebody duck out there. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, we began to fight back. The shock of the ambush had caught the whole column completely by surprise, but the recognition of certain death gave way to training, discipline, and the instinct to survive." End quote. He'd continue later as the Marines kind of regrouped and start to take back block by block in the city that's been overrun by MVA. Earhart writes about the street fighting, quote, "Hour after hour, it continued, minute after minute, half a block, another block, taking fire from all sides. I had never imagined there can be so many NVA in the whole world, and they had to be NVA. The Viet Cong had never had anything like this. The recoilless rifles, the heavy machine guns, not in these numbers. The mythical NVA were real, and they were all in Hue City, and they were all trying to kill me." End quote. Fighting in Hue continues for a month. It's street fighting just like you see in the movies, where groups of men move through city blocks. They're tossing grenades into houses when they hear the NVA are in there. It's the NVA holds a house, troops go to take that house from them. The fighting is brutal, it's vicious, it's terrible. It's slow going, agonizingly slow going, and the Vietnamese are prepared. Despite not having much of a game plan prior to, a couple days before the offensive kicks off, they're prepared and they're fighting doggedly for their imperial city. Bill Earhart wrote about the battle for Hue and how for months he's been in Vietnam fighting and he hasn't been able to grasp the NVA troops. I mean, he hasn't even seen NVA troops. He's come into contact with VC troops here and there, but it is like this issue that's been throughout the whole war is you have soldiers that can't even locate anything to take out their frustrations on. He relates it to grasping at ghosts, and yet here in Hue, the enemy's very real. They're right in front of him. They're trying to kill him, but he's able to fight back. He writes, quote, "It was exhilarating. I was scared utterly witless, but it was the greatest adrenaline high I've ever experienced. To have real armed targets to shoot at, to be able to say, we're going to go over there and take that house away from them, and then proceed to do it, and to stay there and hold it instead of turning around immediately and going back where you came from. At last, to be able to fight back." End quote. A narrative gains traction coming out of Hue where the NVA troops allegedly execute citizens of Hue. And it's the sort of situation where it's hard to know what is true. You'll have some reports that, 3,000 citizens are killed. You have a couple others that maybe only 200 are killed. And yet, what most assuredly does happen is that people living in Hue are caught in the crosshairs because these people haven't evacuated their homes and there's street fighting happening all around them. So whether or not they're executed by NVA or they get caught in a stray grenades blast, certainly civilians are killed, and killed in their hundreds, perhaps even thousands. It's a terrible situation if you're a Vietnamese person living in Hue during the battle, because it's all the worst things about street fighting, about warfare, and you're caught in the midst of it. And more often than not, the situation is so head up that if you're a civilian, you don't even get the chance to cry for help or to clarify yourself. It is soldiers in extremely adverse circumstances that aren't even looking to see what they're shooting at half the time. They hear a noise and boom, whatever it is gets wasted. Michael Hare goes to Hue after fighting's been going on for several days. He writes about what he saw as he's walking through the streets and seeing the bodies in the burned out houses. He says, quote, "In the morning, we crossed the canal on a 2x4 and started walking in until we came across the first of the hundreds of civilian dead that we were to see in the next weeks. An old man arched over his straw hat and a little girl who'd been hit while riding her bicycle, lying there with her arm up like a reproach. They'd been lying out like that for a week. For the first time, we were grateful for the cold." End quote. There's many famous photos that come out of the Battle of Hue from different photographers who were published in Life magazine, and there's one of them where several wounded Marines are lying on a tank. There's one who's got an injured leg, one who has a wrap around his face, and then there's one lying on what looks like a door or a stretcher, and he's either unconscious or dead. It's really difficult to tell. And these stories kind of take on a life of their own because the photographer who takes the photo at the time, it doesn't even know who he's taking photos of, and it's really difficult to track down these Marines afterward. But you get photos like that where it's so raw and real, very different than a lot of the photos that you'll find in propaganda magazines or promotional magazines about the war. Got a closet full of those from my great uncle and his battalion. They put out almost like a perennial or a serial magazine about the different things that the battalion was doing in Vietnam. And these photos adopt a completely different tone. They're visceral and almost put you there. There's photos too of the 1,000-yard stare where a Marine is staring into the camera or maybe just past it. His gaze is dead almost, or his mouth is slightly agape, and he's looking through you, past you, maybe seeing the NVA around the next corner. One of many things that eventually sacks William Westmoreland is the breakdown of intelligence and communication in the U.S. command structure in Saigon, because the intel that is fed to different companies around Hue, maybe at Fubai as they're going to relieve forces at Hue, is that they just have no clue how many NVA are actually in Hue. They think that there's maybe 2,000 of them. There were probably more like 10. And so it leads to Hue being a protracted street-by-street fight, a fight that the soldiers and Marines fighting in Hue aren't trained for, aren't prepared for. The only way you get prepared in a situation like that is by going and doing it and being ankle deep in all the things that, comes along with learning on the fly. The NVA might not have been trained themselves in that style of fighting, but they had the element of the initiative. They had the numbers, and they had that, unquantifiable thing that comes along with fighting for your own country, fighting for a place that is yours, that is so representative of your culture and so important to you. Max Hastings wrote about the impact of the Battle of Hue. Quote, "For many days the High Command fooled itself that Hue represented merely one among the Communists' many Tet failures. In reality, it became by far their biggest success. The NVA and VC were able to forge from it a legend comparable to that of the 1942 American defense of Corregidor, doomed, but heroic." End quote. Eventually, the U.S. do drive the VC-NVA forces out of Hue, but not after taking heavy losses and not after suffering intense dips in morale. And even though they have maybe won the Battle of Hue, and won being a selective term, because do you win if, maybe you have retained the ground, but 80% of the city is destroyed afterward. The morale of the troops who fought in the battle is low, and the opinion of the U.S. forces after the Battle of Hue is low, because you weren't ready. You win because you're able to scrap together a winning effort, but ultimately, even when you win, you lose. In Saigon, the NVA unleashed about 4,000 troops on the city. And these troops even make it into the U.S. Embassy. And I think it's somewhat emblematic of the confusion at the moment. Remember, there used to be a sound that would play on the radio anytime there was a coup. Well, that sound plays on the radio, and people think that there's another coup happening. And so you add that onto the confusion of the moment where you have an attack on Saigon. Big deal, right? But then you also have people in Saigon that are confused about what's actually happening, and they think that there's some sort of political struggle happening between South Vietnamese leaders. Everybody knew, too, and, this is maybe an aside, and I'm not a historian, and so it might be just a way off assumption, but Nguyen Cao Ky and Nguyen Van Tu, not exactly the best of friends. In fact, at one point they ran against each other in that presidential election of 1967. You wonder if that's going in the back of people's minds, right? Hey, maybe Nguyen Cao Ky decided he didn't like being vice president. Maybe he wanted to run the whole show. So you got that sound playing on the radio as VC troops, NVA troops are filtering into Saigon, and Nguyen Cao Ky instigates a curfew. So theoretically, anybody on the streets is an enemy soldier. Sure enough, enemy soldiers are swarming all through Saigon, and they're facing stiff resistance from South Vietnamese forces. VC troops make it into the U.S. Embassy compound as well. Slowly but surely, one by one, the VC commandos that make it into the embassy are killed off by people working in the embassy and the sentries and the guards. Immediately, as soon as the corpses they're not even cool yet, reporters and media personnel filter into the U.S. Embassy compound, and General Westmoreland arrives at the U.S. Embassy compound. He starts surveying the compound, and immediately he makes a mistake for which he's probably going to never be forgiven. He immediately just starts snapping at soldiers, telling them to clean up, shave their faces, clean up the bodies and the debris. He apparently said to anybody standing around him, quote, "I suggest you get this place cleaned up," end quote. He then holds a press conference in front of this corps of news people, and he says, quote, "The enemy, very deceitfully, has taken advantage of the Tet truce to cause maximum consternation." He then continues to say, he suggested that the attack on the capital was diversionary to the communists' main effort in Quang Tri province, end quote. Peter Braystrup, one of the reporters there, a reporter for the Washington Post, then questioned General Westmoreland, and he said, quote, "How could any effort against downtown Saigon be a diversion?" End quote. Westmoreland is holding to this idea to the last that there's going to be some sort of a grand attack at Khe Sanh, that there's going to be some kind of a DMV and Phu Part 2. But that attack is never really incoming. There's a consistent bombardment at Khe Sanh. There's an attack at a base some 8-9 miles away at Lang Vei. That base gets wiped out. Everybody thinks it's going to happen. Khe Sanh's coming. It never really comes. They keep Marines there at Khe Sanh busy, but it turns into a national story that is so disproportionately covered by the media. I think I read that 38% of the media coverage of Tet attacks are focused on Khe Sanh, where no true attack ever really comes. You see a little bit about the Battle of Hue, a little bit about the Battle of Da Nang, a little bit about the attack on Saigon. But those are the spearhead. Those are the main force attacks of the entire Tet offensive. And yet we're focused on Khe Sanh. Why are we so focused on Khe Sanh? Because the general calling the shots, William Westmoreland, is convinced that is where the main attack is going to come from. It never comes. Westmoreland had also delivered an address right before the Tet Offensive where he felt like the war was nearly over, that the American victory was imminent. Decision makers in Washington hear that speech and think, okay, good, things are coming along nicely. And then the Tet Offensive comes. And while the United States holds virtually every position and, kills, if you want to do this thing by body count, I mean, the body count numbers are fantastic. The North Vietnamese lose somewhere between 40 and 60,000 soldiers, depending on what numbers you believe. Some VC units suffer 60% casualties. 60%. U.S. artillery is extremely effective, but it destroys, Hue is reduced to rubble. I think 80% of the city is destroyed. Kon Tum, 20% of the city is destroyed. Ban Mai Thuot, 50-some% of the city is destroyed by artillery. Westmoreland thought the war was nearly over, and it's clearly not nearly over. The victory conditions are inconclusive. If you can inflict such casualties upon an enemy that's clearly not going away, you almost have to reevaluate your victory conditions. Westmoreland makes a call for 209,000 more troops in Vietnam for further escalation, and the Johnson administration in Washington's had enough. After making his call for more men, which he does publicly, by the way, and this is one of those things where if you really want more men, you make this call in private, where it's going to be an affirmative answer. Instead, Westmoreland releases his request to the press, where the American people get word of his request. So everybody knows he's asked for 210,000 more men, but Washington says no. The writing's on the wall for Westmoreland, and he's replaced a couple months later by Creighton Abrams. When Creighton Abrams arrives in Saigon, he's briefed by Fred Wayand, who's describing to Creighton Abrams the successful defense of Saigon. And Abrams remarked, or maybe it was Wayand thought later, either way, one of them thought or said out loud, and if we continue to have successful defenses of Saigon, if we do this again, there might not be any city left. And the sentiment that correspondents start to relay back home is that this type of thing can't continue. You're going to waste the entire country of Vietnam in an effort to win a war. Is that worth it? An NBC pundit said, quote, "We must decide whether destroying Vietnam to save it is justified," end quote. And in Washington, William Fulbright, our old friend, received speculation that perhaps to save the basic caisson, the president was going to authorize the use of an atomic weapon. He then reports on or questions that possibility in public, and the idea is latched onto by everyone to the point where the prime minister in Britain even hears wind of it and says, that's ludicrous. You can't possibly think that you're actually going to drop an atomic weapon to save Khe Sanh. Of course, it was never a real possibility, but the theoretical idea of it sends everybody into a tizzy. Again, you got to think, you've got this Cold War thing going on in the background, and everybody's terrified of the possibility of World War III, that will launch a nuclear weapon, then China will launch a nuclear weapon. You know, the dominoes fall from there. William Fulbright establishes a Senate committee, and Max Hastings writes about their aims in this committee, quote, "In the Senate, the people had been tricked into war under false pretenses through the Tonkin Gulf Resolution," which indeed they had. Almost Clark Gifford's first act on replacing McNamara as defense secretary was to issue an edict to the military. There were to be no more forecasts of imminent victory, end quote. Perhaps the worst thing of all, though, is that Walter Cronkite, the much respected news anchor for CBS, Cronkite tours Vietnam and witnesses Hue, witnesses Saigon. And after seeing all the bodies, all the destruction, Walter Cronkite apparently told Fred Wayand that, quote, "I've seen those thousands of bodies, and I've decided that I'm going to do everything possible in this war to bring it to an end," end quote. Cronkite then, on February 27th, went on the news and told his millions of viewers that, quote, "To say we are closer to victory today is to believe, in the face of the evidence, optimists who have been wrong. To say we are mired in a stalemate seems the only realistic yet unsatisfactory conclusion. It's increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out is to negotiate, not as victims, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to victory and democracy and did the best they could," end quote. It's hard to overstate Walter Cronkite's meaning in all of this, because he is maybe the most respected reporter that there's ever been. He represents the heart of Middle America, as Lyndon Johnson would say. Lyndon Johnson said upon hearing that broadcast, quote, "I've lost Middle America," end quote. I think Washington policymakers are stunned that the voice of reason for America could turn on them so drastically, and yet when faced with the evidence of the bodies, the destruction, the forecasts that the war's no closer to ending now that there's been this massive offensive, it's still no closer to ending than when it started. The fatigue with the fighting in Vietnam has reached now a fever pitch, and if Westmoreland says it's bad, people at home, you might have witnessed the Fulbright hearings. You got a pretty good idea, hey, it's not going well. As soon as Walter Cronkite says it's bad, it's bad. Right after the Tet Offensive, everything seems to be balancing on a bit of a knife's edge. And yet the old Ho Chi Minh quote, now almost ancient history at this point, where he's talking to the French diplomat in the first Indochina War, right before that war kicks off. The quote where he says, or he equates Vietnam fighting the West to a tiger and an elephant, where the tiger can jump out of the brush and take swipes at the elephant, but the elephant's just going to last longer than the elephant, saying in effect that you may want a war with us, but when it comes down to it, we have a larger appetite for suffering than you do. We can take it. The absolute best case and point for Ho Chi Minh's argument is the Tet Offensive. A VC cadre would say later that, quote, I cannot count the number of women who lost 3, 4, even 7 or 8 sons and daughters as martyrs for our cause, end quote. If ever there was a moment when that thesis that Vietnam could outlast anyone else, now was the moment when it would be tested, because the Vietnamese are shattered. They have lost, by some estimates, 40,000 troops, which, when you put that in perspective, that is, in some places, 50% casualties. And I try and remember, just to put it in perspective, that casualties of this number are unheard of in warfare. I mean, if you have 20% casualties, it's devastating. If you have 30% casualties, you are at a point where morale is breaking. 50% casualties should be backbreaking. In some ways, for the Vietnamese, it was. It's going to be tough to find more young men and women to put into the human meat grinder that this conflict has made for the Vietnamese. There's the alignment at the top. Everything flows down from Les One. Maybe it's because of this personal belief. It's a systemic cultural thing that Vietnamese have been fighting off invaders from foreign countries for so many years now. It's part of it. It's part of the experience. They're conditioned for it. And also I try to think, like, what would the United States feel if the shoe was on the other foot? If a foreign invader was coming to the United States and was trying to suppress and oppress Americans, how would Americans respond? Probably very similar. You see lots of movies like Red Dawn, for example, which theorizes what would happen in the event of a North Korean or a Chinese or a Russian invasion of mainland America. How would regular Americans resist? And funny enough, at least in scenarios like that, it looks incredibly similar to what the fighting on the ground looks like in the Vietnam War. On the flip side, while the Vietnamese are reeling with unimaginable casualties, the Americans are faced with a political conundrum. Because while if you're waging the war on a spreadsheet, if you're looking at body count, you would say the United States won. They survived the Tet Offensive. They lost significantly less on the spreadsheet in terms of body count than their opponents did. And they inflicted, in some places, 30 to 50% casualties on their enemies. That's a win, right? Well, it's only a win if you're waging the war on a spreadsheet. There's more aspects to war fighting than body count, as you see with the Tet Offensive. You get this dichotomy where after the Tet Offensive, military folks on the ground, soldiers on the ground, have an opinion about how things are going to go now that they have repulsed the offensive. And their view of things is rather optimistic, because they're thinking, well, if we took that punch, we can take just about any punch they've got. But back home, in the newspapers, in the media, on TV, and in, the conversations on the dinner table, the conversation goes a little bit differently. I found a letter from infantryman Gary Young that he received from his parents in March of 68. And his father writes at the very end of the letter about perception of fighting in Vietnam at this point. Quote, "People in this country are fed up with the dilly-dallying we're getting about Vietnam. It seems like a senseless waste of life. I'd better not get started on that subject or I'll never stop." End quote. You have the political situation, you have the military situation, and what do you think is going to win? Politically, the narrative surrounding Vietnam at this point takes on a fatalist sort of view. But while people debate at home whether or not the war should continue, what is the point, right? We don't know what the victory conditions are. We're not going to invade North Vietnam. We're certainly not going to get into it with China. What are we doing? While that's the view at home and protests are rising and unrest is rising, soldiers on the ground think that perhaps if they've taken the haymaker shot and survived it, they should get back up off the canvas and parry. So military operations continue. Creighton Abrams takes over with this new infusion of optimism that he brings to MAC-V. Operations continue as normal with a slight tweak. We're still doing search and destroy missions, but we're going to call it a different name. We're going to pretty much change nothing, but the perception is going to be a little bit different because we got new blood in the big office at MAC-V. On March 15th, 1968, Charlie Company and the 1st Battalion were briefed by their captain, Ernest Medina, on an operation they would undertake the next day in a hamlet called Pinkville. This operation was a search and destroy operation trying to find VC operators. And in this area called Pinkville, the soldiers were told by Medina to, quote, "kill everything that moves," end quote. The idea was going to be that they were going to land in a hot LZ, meaning a place where they would land under enemy fire, and then they would go through and clean out the VC in Pinkville. Nick Terse writes about what happened next, quote, "Advancing in small squads, the men of the unit shot chickens as they scurried about, pigs as they bolted, and cows and water buffalo lowing among the thatch-roofed houses. They gunned down old men sitting in their homes and children as they ran for cover. They tossed grenades into homes without even bothering to look inside. An officer grabbed a woman by the hair and shot her point blank with a pistol. A woman who came out of her home with a baby in her arms was shot down on the spot. As the tiny child hit the ground, another GI opened up on the infant with his M16 automatic rifle. Over 4 hours, members of Charlie Company methodically slaughtered more than 500 unarmed victims, killing some in ones or twos, others in small groups, and collecting many more in a drainage ditch that would become an infamous killing ground. They faced no opposition. They even took a quiet break to eat lunch in the midst of the carnage. Along the way, they also raped women and young girls, mutilated the dead, systematically burned homes, and fouled the area's drinking water." End quote. This massacre would remain a mystery to the American people for about a year. This massacre takes place in a hamlet called My Lai. And if not for a single veteran, Ron Ridenhour, we might not even know about it today, because Ridenhour took it upon himself to report upon what he saw, the atrocity that he saw, the brutalism that he saw. My Lai was reported by Westmoreland and his fellow generals as a successful VC clearing operation. But with the help of Seymour Hersh, Ridenhour investigated and collected documents and reports upon what happened at My Lai. The Pentagon tried to discredit Seymour Hersh and Ridenhour's research. But eventually an army inquiry took place, and the inquiry officially determined that 30 individuals were involved in criminal misconduct during the massacre. 28 of those were officers, including 2 generals, and the inquiry concluded that they had committed a total of 224 serious offenses. The only person charged with any wrongdoing, though, was Charlie Company's Lieutenant William Calley. He was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of 22 civilians, but President Nixon freed him from prison and allowed him to remain under house arrest. He was eventually paroled. 25 years later, Ron Ridenour would write about My Lai this way. He would say, quote, "At the end of it, if you ask people what happened at My Lai, they would say, 'Oh yeah, isn't that where Lieutenant Calley went crazy and killed all those people?' No, that was not what happened. Lieutenant Calley was one of the people who went crazy and killed a lot of people at My Lai. But this was an operation, not an aberration." End quote. One of the theories about how a thing like My Lai can ever possibly happen is that it was perpetrated by some stray wild dogs, if you will. Some crazy individuals that went off the handle, some bad apples. Because how else can you rationalize a group of men that are raised in a country where, and even a society, in a culture where this sort of thing is the most despicable thing possible? How can you rationalize a group of men flying off the handle? Well, it seems like bad apples is probably the nice way of putting it, that search and destroy operations put men in situations where your orders are to kill. You, from boot camp, are told that your enemy is something less than human, so it makes it easier for you to kill. And you are in a country where every corner you go around might be the last corner you go around, because on the other end of that corner, there might be a VC soldier with an AK-47 ready to empty his clip into you. You have this perpetual fear. You have this perpetual anger and angst. And it culminates when you're put on an operation where your captain tells you to kill everything that moves. Michael Hare wrote about the mental state, I guess, of somebody who is there, who witnesses all of the things that these soldiers would have witnessed. He says, quote, "Disgust doesn't begin to describe what they made me feel. They threw people out of helicopters, tied people up, and put the dogs on them. Brutality was just a word in my mouth before that, but disgust was only one color in the whole mandala. Gentleness and pity were other colors. There wasn't a color left out. I think that those people who used to say that they only wept for the Vietnamese never really wept for anyone at all, if they couldn't squeeze out at least one for these men and boys when they died or had their lives cracked open before them." End quote. Lasting effects don't come to the foreground until March 31st. To this point, you have a lot of posturing. You have a lot of questions being thrown out in the halls of government, like, what's next? What are we doing now? How do we counter? Questions about what are the victory conditions? Do we need to adjust how we're doing this? And a lot of people would agree, yes. More so than that, you're getting decision makers, military personnel saying, the ship has sailed on the United States winning the war decisively. At this point now, we're just trying to save face. The ramifications politically come to a head on the 31st when Lyndon Johnson sits down in front of the nation and announces that he is no longer going to run for his next term as president. He announces the cessation of bombing north of the 20th parallel. He announces that he is going to open negotiations with the North Vietnamese. The feeling in the wake of this announcement, of this address by Lyndon Johnson, is shock. People start to wonder, was that real? Did our president just say that he's not going to run again? Did he just admit publicly that his presidency has failed? What else do you take from that? Bill Moyers, the former White House press secretary, said that Lyndon Johnson's Vietnam obsession was, quote, an atrocious marriage of ego and nationhood, so that Johnson saw himself as America involved in some sort of challenge to manhood, end quote. It tracks if you approach the entire conflict as we're just doing a police action to get these Vietnamese in line, to get this third world country to recognize its place in world affairs. But it seems like Johnson arrived at the realization of what was actually happening a bit too late. The realization that the North Vietnamese are not a backwater country, that their military is not, a collection of just people in black pajamas. They are wielding modern weapons. They are far more organized and committed to the cause than anybody could have ever imagined. And all of these things put together make them an extremely formidable enemy. And we've gone to their home field expecting to sweep them off the field. Hasn't happened yet. And Lyndon Johnson must have realized it wasn't going to happen. The lack of results, the ability for regular people to see those lack of results on TV, hearing about stories of soldiers cutting off ears, mutilating bodies, throwing people out of helicopters, stories about civilians being hit by bombs, stories about civilians being shot by soldiers in helicopters. These start to leak out as soldiers rotate back to the world, become disillusioned with the fighting as a whole, as, a nation becomes disillusioned with the fighting. Lyndon Johnson is the tip of the spear. America is broken. And yet, like Michael Hare said about the punch-drunk boxer that's too dumb to give it up, the war has 7 more years. 7 more years of Americans and Vietnamese dying in a war where the outcome has already been concluded. We know how the story ends, and yet, like a punch-drunk fighter, the Americans still don't know when to give it up. The best and the brightest have done their best, and yet the Vietnam War is still pretty much in the exact same place as what they inherited. It hasn't gone up and to the right as you would like to see, and there's new blood coming into Washington that have their own ideas about how the war should continue. You've got characters like Richard Nixon, Henry Kissinger. These two are going to shape the next 7 years, the final 7 years of how this war is going to go, and they're going to do it altogether differently than Lyndon Johnson did it, than John F. Kennedy did it. It's going to be a new tone, a bit more belligerent, and some might say even worse. Suffering on the ground for people involved in the conflict gets no better, and the United States will find themselves turning to unlikely allies in order to perpetuate the war effort. All that and more coming up in the final edition of Hell in a Small Place, Hell in a Small Place, Part 5. I just want to say before we get out of here, thank you to all of you, as always, for listening, supporting, rating, and reviewing the show. It does mean the world to me. I've got something new to report on the social media front. I started a Substack so that if you are interested in these shows, you can get an email in your inbox when they go live. Plus, some other writings or bonus podcasts, things like that as I think of them. I have kicked around some ideas for really, really short stuff, just stream of consciousness things. I haven't posted them because I'm not sure if they're any good, if they're right, but I will hopefully continue to post things on there that will be just extra material. But the real skinny of it is if you want to receive an email in your email inbox whenever an episode goes live, go to Substack. I will post those there, and you can be kept abreast of all things happening over here in my world. Again, thank you so much for all your support, for listening, rating, reviewing, and telling a friend about it. It means the world to me. Have a good one, everyone. I will see you hopefully very soon.